And
Yeah, we're live.
excellent.
So welcome everybody. We're doing an impromptu live stream because we're talking about a subject that is dear to everybody's heart, I think. And we thought it was important to discuss this in public, also with the public. And what we're going to be talking about is the meaning crisis versus a faith crisis, and the way that these problems are different. They require different approaches. They require different tools to relate to, and it's important to uh, not confuse these things, because if you're approaching someone who is in a meaning crisis with answers to their lack of faith, you're not gonna find resonance. Like there's a distance that needs to be bridged that is too big, because if you look at people as um, I guess a building of things over time, so they build up these skills of relating to the world, then you can imagine that in order to ride a bicycle, you first need to develop balancing. And if you never have learned to balance, you can't just go sit on a bicycle and learn how to ride a bicycle. No, you first need to balance. And the balancing is not a propositional thing, right? Like it's a way of being in the world. And if you've never experienced that, if you've never had access to that, because maybe you always lay in the bed because you were sick all the time or whatever, right? Then you have a stunted development in some sense, and you need to develop these skills first before you can develop the more complicated skills that are dependent upon primary skills, right? And then, so when we're talking about meaning crisis, we're talking about people who have a disconnection from being, right? From participating in being mode, right? Which is a modality where you are present, you are in some sense being subjected by your environment, you're expressing yourself in relationship to your environment, and that allows you to swim through water, right? Like you're in the spirit that is moving you effectively. And Vervaeke is also talking about having mode, which is more so a mode where you're trying to achieve something, like getting a glass of water to drink, right? Like you have an objective that you're trying to manifest in the world, and there's a clear path to the objective. And then you might have some skills that you need to be in order to manifest that. But the primary way that you're looking at yourself and your relationship with the world is by manifesting what you need, well, your will effectively. And when that is a modality that is primary to you, and you have no good relationship with your being mode, right, or you don't have an intentional relationship with that, then there's certain things that aren't available to you. Like there's certain ways of being in the world and understanding the world even that are too far away from your present experience to understand. And that's kind of like a prerequisite to gain that understanding is a prerequisite to living in faith. And that is a thing that I and Mark have been really frustrated about, like that people don't seem to understand that distinction, or if they do seem to understand it, they don't know what the implications of that are. And our project that we are trying to achieve is to try and find ways to give people tools to take that first step. Because Vervaeke is talking about the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? So if you're in a having mode, if you're trying to manifest your goal all the time, then the way that you understand people is either they're allies that contribute to you manifesting that goal, or they're obstacles. Like they're ways, they're in your way of you expressing your will. And when people are in your way, you have an adversarial relationship, and then you get into conflict with people, right? And that hermeneutics of suspicion is another thing, another obstacle that is in the way of people developing these skills, right? Because they're unable to accept an authority that is informing them of how to have the right relationship, right? Like a faith relationship with the world. And so yeah, that's kind of the path that we're on. So yeah, like Mark, you want to add something?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that happened that I was sort of excited about was the stream that Jacob had me come on when Teo was talking because he had questions, and the idea that Teo is seeing the same thing that I'm seeing is that there's two different distinct groups of people, right? There's people who have a crisis of faith, right? They're having a crisis of faith. That's that they're in that situation. So they were in the church, they understand the church, they get at least some unconscious appreciation for symbols and symbolic meaning and symbolic understanding, right? And then something happens, right? And that creates their crisis. It's usually them hitting the wall at a high speed because they tried to take the wheel, right? And then that's one set of problems. But because they have faith, they can come back into the faith. Like that's an easy thing for them to do because they've been there before. Whereas the meaning crisis stuff seems completely different to me, right? It seems like you're further down that ladder. You've never had faith. You don't even understand what faith is. You're assuming that you don't need religion because philosophy does that. Like philosophy tells you truth. You don't need anything else, right? And of course the worst problem is most of these people don't even know the philosophy. They're just assuming it's there and they're assuming they have it. And if you start talking to them about philosophy, it's clear they don't know any philosophy or they don't know enough to be useful. And that means they're in some sense further away or further back than the people who just have a crisis of faith. And I think with the Christian framing, what's happening is people like Paul van der Klee are seeing it in, we'll say, the terms of religious revival in the US, which was a movement that happened. And so you can cast John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson in the revival framework, but I don't think it fits. I don't think that's what they're doing. I don't think that's close enough to to where they are to be useful. And it certainly isn't useful outside the US because if you don't, and even mostly inside the US, because if you don't understand the revivalist movement, I think it was the late 1800s or mid to late 1800s, then you don't even understand how that works. And revival is really important if you have something to revive. In other words, you have to have had it first in order to revive it. Whereas the meaning crisis stuff, I literally think they don't even have that. And so we're sort of further back when the meaning crisis people are from where the meaning crisis people are when we're talking about the elements of crisis of faith, which with the church people understand crisis of faith really well. I just don't think they understand the severity of the meaning crisis. How would you like to start things out here, Teo?
Um, by first of all, apologizing because I'm gonna have to jump off stream for a bit because I've got I've got extra thing that I needed to sort out. But just to before I jump on, just to lay where before I jump back on, just to lay where I stand is I really like the distinction you've made between meaning crisis and faith crisis. It's um I don't know if I say it completely the way you say it, but that distinction rings true to the people, my friends, the people that are around me. There's it's a different sort of crisis with the ones that have connections to faith or usually via their parents, and and also it's the sons and daughters of immigrants, like specifically that I'm thinking of, like they've got connections to the faith of their parents. But my other friends that have no faith, it's even if their parents do have some faith, it's been they've got diluted faith. So by the time it gets to the children, it's basically nothing, and they've resorted to what just the culture has to offer. And I don't see them as having no faith. I see them as having an inability to recognize the faith that they do have, or just having anything to do with faith they think of as you said, religious, like philosophies, and that science like prove that isn't real, God is dead. All of it just doesn't ring true to them because they grew up in a world where that's the narrative that they live in. But yeah, let me just sort out my estuary thing, and then I'll jump back on and we'll have more conversations.
Okay, great. So yeah, so I think we want to explore this distinction. Maybe we want to start off with some definitions because that's always good, right? Like we have meaning, right? Like and so meaning is in some sense the result of you having a connection with something, right? And then as a consequences of your relationship with what you're connected to, then that you have to give that a place, right? And that place is meaningful in some sense, right? And then you can do that to words, right? So you give a meaning to words, right? Like what are they referencing to? Like what is the connection that they're representing or that they're enabling? And you also have meaning to you as a person in participation, right? Like if I play a game, I like playing the game, right? Like if I have an emotion, like I might dislike having that emotion, or I might like having that emotion, or I might find use in that emotion. Like there's a value in the emotion to me that because it points out something of importance in the world, right? So that is what meaning is, right? And so meaning is related to your ability to be connected in the world. So if you're connected all the time, you find meaning in everything, right? Because it affects you, it applies to you, and you're part or you're participating in the theater of life effectively, right? Like you know your role, and you can look at yourself as inhabiting that role and being affected by the things around you, and that makes it meaningful, right? Like now you have a way to judge yourself, you have a way to judge others, right? Like it allows a bunch of things, right? You can judge something according to a bunch of rules written on a piece of paper, or you can judge something based upon how it is affecting you, right? Like, oh, like this is affecting me negatively, so there must be something negative about it that is having that effect on me. Now, when we're talking about fate, I think fate is more related to your connection to potential, to what isn't in front of you, right? Like it's not a connection that is directly present, but it's connected to a spiritual connection, right? Like what is the structure that is keeping you up, right? Like what are the things beyond the material that are of importance and that guide you through your life, and what is your relationship to them? How do you maintain that relationship? Like what does that require of you, right? So there's an ineffability, right? Like to these things, like they're, you can say they're in heaven, right? Or they're in the platonic realm, right? Like they're in the ineffable, right? Like you can't touch them, and the only way that you can have a relationship with them is by experiencing them through your participation. And what I and Mark, I think, are arguing is that those are two steps, right? So first you need to have the connectedness, and in the connectedness you participate, and then when you have a sense of the state of being in participation, you can pick up on these ineffable patterns that present themselves in the participation, and you can relate to this world that is behind the material world, right? Like in some sense that is, or above it, right? Like that guides it, that informs what happens in the material world. And then you like Peterson says, right? Like you don't want to win the game, but you want to win the game of games, right? And relating to the game of games is something totally different than relating to the game that you're in.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think in order to make meaning, you have to have a way of connecting things in the world, right? And if you don't have that way, in other words, if you don't have a story, right, that's large enough to contain your role relative to the other roles And because everything's relative in that frame, you also need an absolute set, right, to build on. If you don't have that, then the tools that you need to interact with are different from the tools that you need to interact with if you had a frame before. Right? If you had a perfectly working frame that was able to encompass everything and allow you to make meaning in the world, then what that means is that you can go back there. You can do that again. But the meaning crisis people never had that story. They never had that frame. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't influenced by it indirectly, but there's a difference between, say, having gone to church, when you were young, right? Versus never having gone to church when you were young. So yeah, the cultural cognitive grammar is still there, but because you never participated in any of those things, it's a different interaction and a different set of skills and tools that needs to be built up in order for you to become involved in the art of making meaning again, right? And the ability to make meaning. And that is very different from returning to your faith. Returning is different from never having been there and getting in the first place. They're just different. And that really is part of what I think that the gap is, we'll say. Like the set of skills that somebody like Vervaeke brings are very useful if you're stuck in an individualistic sort of materialistic frame where nothing has any, we'll say, significance in terms of connectedness, right? You still have to understand what connectedness is and why it's used, why you want to do that, because there's a lot of downsides to being connected to other people. They suck, for example, and they yell at you and they point out when you're wrong, because if I live in my head, I'm never wrong. It's freaking great. Everything I say is perfectly correct, right? And then, you want me to talk to a disagreeable person like Manuel? Like, goodness, no. Right? Because, it totally makes sense. Like, it's completely reasonable, rational, logical, and totally within the realm of something that people should be considering, right? But it's not, it limits you. And then if you don't understand that trade-off, I'm limited by my lack of faith in my ability to cooperate with others, because that's ultimately what it boils down to. If you don't have faith, you can't cooperate with people. And you can use faith in multiple layers, right? Right. If you want to cooperate with one person, you have to have faith that they're going to deal with you in a fashion that is not going to be too abrasive for you, right? Whatever that is, right? And if you want to cooperate with many people, you have to have faith that their goal and your goal line up close enough that you'll both be happy with the outcome that otherwise you couldn't manifest. And if you want to have faith living in a political system, you have to have faith that government system, is close enough and going to give you enough of the answers that you want, enough of the time that everything will be okay, right? And so that's part of the problem, is that we literally don't have faith at any level, and that's causing us to be unable to cooperate in an important way. And so that's worth actually noting, right? And I think that's part of the problem. If you've had faith, it's easier to get it back. And if you've been in a meaning crisis, right? If you just went straight into meaning crisis from your materialist worldview that was working just fine until it wasn't, right? Until something happened. And maybe that something wasn't an event. Maybe it was just you reached the end of what it could provide, right? So I think when Pastor Paul Van der Clay talks about the end of modernity, I like to cast that as the end of materialism as a workable model for understanding the world. Like, oh, there's all this stuff happening and it cannot be explained by physics, by economics, by politics, by any of these other framings, right? By science in general. There are things that aren't explainable in those ways, right? And so that's the end of modernity in some ways, but it happens differently for different people because you end up differently engaged, at different times with this inevitable thing. And maybe it's brought on by a death in the family. Maybe it's brought on by just thinking too much. Maybe it's brought on by meeting somebody you want to converse with and being unable to converse with them and realizing that you don't know why, because by all the rules of conversation, you should be able to talk to this person. And yet they seem not to be following the rules. And it's like, well, that's because conversation doesn't actually have rules in that way, right? And so if that happens to you and you've never cooperated in faith at any layer, just with another person or just with a group of other people, maybe all your cooperation was based on economics or based on politics, right? And it doesn't matter how they were seeing it. It matters how you were seeing it. And now all of a sudden that's not working for you. What do you do, right? What do? You can't go back. There's nothing to go back to, right? And so what are the steps that, as a hardcore materialist who never had faith, what are the steps to get them out of their situation, right? Whatever that looks like. Those, and I'm going to say it again, that's a very different set of things from what you would have to do for somebody who has a crisis of faith to get them someplace nice, right? Which is probably back in the church for them. Maybe it's not in the church for the meaning crisis people, although I'm sure that all the Christians would argue that it is. So that's really what Teo sort of hit on initially was, I don't know, I see two different groups of people. Yeah, there's definitely at least two different groups of people. And I mean, we'll probably make the argument at some point, so I'll throw it out there now. The knowledge engine model, see navigating patterns, the knowledge engine video, right, has this thing called poetic information. And that, I think, is the difference between the two. People who have a crisis of faith have access to the poetic because they've been in a situation where symbolism is relevant and connected. And people who haven't had that involvement probably have no access to symbolism whatsoever. And that creates a bunch of problems because now they cannot connect the world in certain ways. That's technically what we're talking about with that model. But I don't want to dig down into that rabbit hole. Manuel.
So I want to introduce an analogy, right? So it's like having an orchard. And you either have an orchard and the plants or the trees are there, and like you have had an irrigation system, right? And like they just withered, and you need to prune the trees, like you need to do all of these things, but they're still there, right? Like, and they're still giving some fruit, although they're not in an optimal relationship to what they could be doing. Or you need to build an orchard from scratch. You need to invent the irrigation system. You need to plant each tree individually, right? Like, and then they need to stand somewhere in relation to each other. So there's this whole system, right, that is implicit in some people and just totally absent in other people. And building a new orchard or revivifying, right, an old orchard, right? Like, what was the word that we were using, Mark? It was resurrecting the orchard. That was what we were talking. Yeah, revival. Right. So there's a revival of what is, but if there's no is that can be revived, what you need to do is a totally different thing. You need to train people to cultivate an orchard, right? And like you need to help them put in the irrigation and all of these things, right? Like they require things, right? So you need to have practices. Like Vervaeke is really right about this. Like there's these practices that you do in order to do upkeep on yourself and the way that you're being. So it's important to have these things that maintain what you have built, right? And then, well, what does that look like? Why is that important, right? And maybe most important of all, like, why would you even undergo such a project? Like, what would bring you to the place that you'd be motivated to quit playing your computer games, or instead of going to the soccer club where you're drinking beer afterwards, you go to a place, right, where you're intentionally busy cultivating meaning and wisdom, right? Like why would you do that? Like, what's the argument that you can present to people that allows them to go there? And I think we should be working on that, like, because I can make arguments, right? But these arguments are propositional, right? Like, they're in Vervaeke's framework. They require a bunch of knowledge. They require you to to have a certain understanding, and then that's really amazing if you're there. But if you're not there, like how do I reach you? And bringing the good news, right, is like you need to bring the good news in a way that a person can understand what the good news is. And when Mark is talking about not having lived in faith ever, right? Like what do you live in? Well, you live in trust. Well, what is trust, right? Like it's like, okay, I do something and I see a reaction. I can understand the reaction, right? Like so there's a material manifestation that justifies my relationship, right? And when you're in faith, you don't have that direct justification, right? Like you're believing in something that you trust will manifest something, but you don't have a guarantee, because we're talking about this ineffable thing again, right? Like whether that is because you're both aiming towards the same goal, right? And like you trust the other person to do commit for a year.
The direct relationship is not there, right? Trust is usually based on a direct relationship in the moment, and faith is not based on a direct relationship in the moment. And I think, it just sort of occurred to me, one of the differences, that Sally Joe pointed out ages ago that really sort of gets it, because I didn't see it at all. But she saw it. She was like, "What?" And she thought it was obvious, and I think was sort of surprised that I didn't notice, right? Peterson is educating. When you watch Maps of Meaning or even the Biblical Lecture Series, he's in educator mode. He's teaching you something. And I think Vervaeke, he talks about practices, but really what practices are doing or trying to do, in my mind, is they are the education of your participation in the world, right? And so he's trying to give you, instead of like practice things you can do to get results, he's actually, maybe John doesn't really understand this, or at least doesn't understand it the way we understand it. He's trying to give you a set of skills that you can use, right, to solve a problem. And in this case, his big selling point, and it did come out today, one of his pre videos for After Socrates, his big selling point is, what you need is not more knowledge, you need wisdom, right? And he says that over and over again. And it's like, well, then, we need an education program for wisdom. Like, I kind of agree, right? So that's when we're talking about practices, we're really talking about things that educate you in wisdom. I think that's the way to think about it, right? And get you in contact with knowledge in a way that can't be done any other way. And I think that's really a big difference, because again, if you've been in the church and you've had the church experience and you've been able to engage and you understand the symbolism, maybe unconsciously, maybe it's not conscious, right? And maybe it doesn't have to be. I think this consciously understanding things is a way overrated way of dealing with the world in general. I don't need to consciously understand how I breathe to breathe. It's not saying that bringing some consciousness to it sometimes isn't helpful. Of course it is. There's a breathing, the Wim Hof type stuff, right? Absolutely, can be very powerful, but you still wouldn't use it all the time. Right? You're not going to be rational all the time. You're not going to be reasoning things out all the time. You're not going to be applying logic to everything you do. That's insane. You can't do that, and you're not doing it. But you don't need to. Like, you don't need to justify your faith, right? You don't need to understand every line of the Bible in order to be a good Christian. Like, you just don't need to, right? And you don't need to explain things to enact them. A lot of people know how to do gardening and can't explain gardening to any other human. That's still useful, because at least you've got them gardening. And maybe they could teach you to garden, but it would require a practice on your part of coming to watch them while they're gardening every day. And that may be a way to learn. And then you don't have to make it propositional at all. And that's one of the powers, I think, of Vervaeke's propositional knowledge idea, is that, again, he's not saying knowledge isn't the highest thing, although I don't think it is. But he is saying maybe there's more to knowledge than what you understand to be knowledge. And that at least opens the door for people to start participating. And then, opens the door for practices. Like, maybe you don't know everything you need to know, and maybe the things you need to know are more around participation. So why don't you participate in meditation? Why don't you participate in a moving practice like Qigong, right? Why don't you participate in something like reading the classics so that instead of assuming you have a philosophy and that replaces religion, that you can actually find out you didn't have that philosophy to begin with, and it doesn't replace religion, because both of those seem to be true.
Yeah, and I think looking at wisdom as a way to wield, like you're wielding yourself as an agent in the world. Sometimes you're wielding bigger bodies, right? Like if you're leading a group of people, you're wielding a group of people as an agency in the world, right? And so, well, what does it require to wield something? Well, that requires you to understand how you're affecting things and how you're being affected by things in the world, right? So that's a dynamic relationship, right? Like that's a feeling based, that's an intuition based something, right? And in that sense, it doesn't need the proposition, right? But in that sense, there's also dangerous aspects, or at least scary aspects, right? Because now you don't know, right? Like like if the leader is leading on intuition, like how can you hold them to account, right? Like it's really difficult. And yes, right, like that is a problem. And it's easy to go through these propositional understandings, right? Oh, if we just make a model of it and then look at the model, then we know what to correct. But then the question is, well, how do you implement the model, right? Because like people need to enact, and like then we get back to the participation again. And like so you're never going to be able to escape the participation and getting to the acceptance of that, and then experiencing the importance of that, right? Like what is the change in your agency? What change in your agency happens when you start understanding that instead of you being a dictator of yourself and maybe the people around you, you are actually in a dance. You're manifesting something beautiful, and your role is to lift up that beauty, right? And then to enact the good within that. And and so when you start seeing that, right, like then you can start having faith, right? Because now you need to start having conception. Okay, like what is beauty, right? Like what is how I experience beauty? What is the good that I'm trying to manifest? Like am I trying to manifest efficiency as a good, or am I trying to manifest something that is more in the sense of the integratedness of the whole, right? Where you're accounting for all of these aspects that need to come together, and they need to get primacy, and sometimes other things need to get primacy, so that whatever structure you're in, whether it's your body or a group of people, can stay alive, right? Like it can flourish as well. Like it's not good enough
Right.
to stay alive.
But I want to address this. This is an excellent question, as usual. Lynn comes up with excellent questions. Please explain the importance of failure within the faithless and how that is related to the decline of modernity, or is it? Well, look, I mean, I think that it's a really good question, right? Because you're really kind of getting at the relationship between, we'll say, the reasons for a crisis of faith versus the reasons for a meaning crisis, and they're both related to this, modernity sort of framing. Although, again, I don't like the I don't like that idea, right? I think it's more of the failure of materialism, right? Which modernity brought about, maybe, but it's not helpful, right? But because of the rise of the primacy of science, because of the rise of the primacy of the objective worldview, right, that replaces the religious worldview. And I think that's what Jonathan Peugeot is talking about. Like, the medieval people didn't need an objective worldview because they had something better, quite honestly. They had a better worldview. And then it's not mere science that comes along. It's also the propaganda, although that's a word that I have all kinds of problems with, but it's the propaganda around science. So people are being told about the power of science. Oh, you can do this with science, you can do that with science. Most of the things people tell you to do with science cannot be done with science. I hate to break it to you. Science people give science credit for inventing things. Science has invented nothing ever, and it's not supposed to, so that's fine. right? So science isn't a search for truth. That's not the purpose of science, right? There's all kinds of claims that people are making for science that aren't true. But it's that objective worldview where it's like, oh, well, I have science because I can, I guess, right? That's what people are told, or we have science as a culture or something. And therefore, I don't need anything else because science gives me accurate, precise certainty in control of the world. And that's the problem, is that if you buy into that, right, then either if you never had a religion, you buy into that and you're just a hardcore materialist, like a Sam Harris type, right? Or you're in a church and you buy into that, and then you're like, you know what? You have a bump in the road with your faith, and all of a sudden you're like, I'm going to rely on the materialism because it's there. I can just rely on the science. I don't need this whole faith framework that I'm familiar with. I don't need these symbols. I can just do without them. But again, and that's like absolutely right. But they've had access, right? So again, it's different when you've had faith to get back in than when you never had faith because you never used it, because you never needed it, because it was never part of your life. That's a totally different thing. And again, if you want to think of it as like how far down the well you are, the people who have a crisis of faith, yeah, they drop down the well for sure, but they drop like halfway, right? The meaning crisis people were never out of the well. They were already halfway down. So when they drop halfway, they hit bottom, right? They go straight to the nihilism. And sure, crisis of faith people can go further down. It just takes longer. And this is something we were talking with Teo with on the Discord server before we jumped on the stream. It takes longer, and there's more ways to get the crisis of faith people out of their crisis. But the meaning crisis people, there are fewer ways because they don't have access to those things that the people who were in faith once have. It's not there. Like it's the difference. You know, I like your analogy, Manuel, but I'll use a slightly different one. There's a big difference between buying a house and fixing it up and buying a plot of land and building a house, right? And buying a house and fixing it up, you can argue, is less work in some ways than building a house. But ultimately, it's not, because you have a vision, there's a framework, right? You already have an idea, right? Even if you tear that house down and put it in another place, there was a context existing. And that helped you in ways you cannot understand at all. Because if it was there, you engaged with it, right? When you buy a plot of empty land, you don't know how far set back from the street you want to be. You know, there's all kinds of things. And yeah, you can build whatever you want. And boy, is it easier to build new than it is to rip stuff out and put stuff up in some cases. But it's a totally different set of problems. And it's a different set of skills. I can easily rehab a house by myself. I've done it. Not hard, right? I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's not difficult. I cannot build a house by myself from scratch. Can't do it. I don't have those skills because it's a different set of skills. And that's the difference between the meaning crisis and a crisis of faith. Like that's what we're pointing at.
Yeah, and I think looking at the people in faith dropping out of faith, right? Like in some sense, they're getting tempted by the immediate gratification of, well, the material worldview, right? Like the material worldview is really good in relating to the here and now, right? Like, so if I want to have a car, I just have to get money and then I get a car, right? Like, so there's this way in which it can provide for you, right? But then when we're talking about things that are ineffable, right? Like part of the reason that they're ineffable is because they don't manifest immediately, but they manifest across time. So it takes a while for your mental health or your spiritual health to decline, right? Like you have all of these patterns that you're still acting out, right? Like they're just in your system, right? So you just, even if you don't go to church anymore, like you still have all these methods of relating to the world that are integrated within you. But if you don't do upkeep to them, right? Like if you don't do upkeep to your house, right? Like things are going to break, right? And if you don't realize that they're breaking because your attention is at the wrong place, right? Because that's kind of what you're doing at church, right? You're trying to put your attention at the right place to see whether there's things in you that need fixing, and maybe there's people around you that are so nice to tell you, well, like maybe you should attend to this because like you seem to have a trouble with that, right? Or I know this plumber, maybe you should talk to this plumber, like because that person knows about how to deal with that part of your house. And so there's a distinction there, and when you don't have these things, right? Like you can just be completely blind to these aspects inside of it, right? And then effectively you cope with them with trauma, right? So either you have a coping mechanism, right? Like something that's just come down upon you as a consequence of where you were in life, or you just ignore it, right? And at a certain point, like that's gonna bite you. Like that problem is gonna manifest in some way, and like you're not gonna have the tools to deal with it, and it's gonna bring you down. And that's where people become apathetic, right? Like apathy is the intentional rejection of connectedness, right? So what if you don't have a good way to be connected? Well, the best thing that you can do is you can reject that connection, right? Like if you reject the connection, then you don't have the emotional distress, right? Like you're not in the frame of responsibility and stuff like that will make you feel guilty about it, right? And then, well, that's where we drop into nihilism, right? Because now all the meaning disappears, right? Like you might have participated in some things subconsciously, right? But when you start getting into the space of apathy, you draw into yourself and out of participation with the world. And I think the other thing that Lynn was talking about, right? Like I think failure as such, right? Like when you're in fate, right? Like if you have a fate framework, when you fail, you take responsibility, right? If you're in a non-fate framework, then there is a bug in the system, right? Like the system didn't manifest what it should manifest, right? And now there's an externality that you're going to impose the problem upon, right? So you're going to blame the world for the things that are wrong with you because you don't have a relationship where you don't have a way of seeing what is wrong with you or what could be right with you. And I think that is, yeah. And then when you start running into these things, right, like that's where the end of modernity comes in, right? Like if the systems that you're using stop being able to provide the things that you need, right? Because like there's no pragmatic implementation that is working, then that's where like people start retreating from modernity and saying, well, oh, there needs to be more, right? And that's where Peterson and Vervaeke jump in, and they're like, well, yeah, you've not been looking at things, and there's things to be looking at, and that is a way to appeal to people. And welcome back, Theo.
Yeah. Just to jump in the last bit I caught, I think you're kind of right with the observation that the people in the meaning crisis resort to blaming the world for the problems that run wrong with them and also wrong with the world. And I think, speaking as someone with faith, like what faith affords is saying the correlation between what's wrong with you and what's wrong with the world, and like going through that process. So it starts with you and then into the world. Whereas if you're the meaning crisis, people say as the world is wrong and that's why everything is wrong because everything in the world is wrong. So yeah, I think that makes sense if I understand what you're saying. But jumping back into where I left off with the faith crisis and meaning crisis, I don't know if I've got a good grasp of it, so I just want to play around with it a little bit. I don't know if it's a gap like this or if it's just different crisis. So does that make sense? That is it?
Yeah.
So because right now the framing that I think you're given is there's a jump between the meaning crisis and the faith crisis, and the meaning crisis people can't even have faith conversations before we bridge this gap. And
Right.
yeah.
Right. So yeah. So let's just loop in this comment. So how simply can you explain what faith means in this context? Okay, I think we kind of went over this earlier, but let me give it a shot. Because Manuel said it last time, so maybe my framing will be a little bit different and helpful. Probably not, but that's okay. We'll give it a shot anyway. So yeah, I mean, trust is something where you're expecting a certain outcome for a certain result, and usually trust comes as the result of a previous interaction. In other words, I had this interaction, worked out this way, so it's probably going to work out this way again, right? Whereas faith, you're not even looking at first order effects, right? So I can have faith that God is going to do right by me, okay? And now I can lose my whole family like Job. I only said that to invoke a certain person onto the stream. Anyway, right? And then everything works out in the end for him, kind of, right? Like, not that there isn't something in the middle, but like, you know, in his darkest days of depression and apathy and, you know, anger, right, and frustration, he keeps faith, even though there's no reason for him to trust God anymore, because God is basically not giving him, you know, it's taking everything away from him, really, right? And so yeah, exactly what wild appears. And so that's the difference. Is Job doesn't trust God, right, in the way he says trust his friends, and like his trust in his friends is broken. His faith in God is not, right? So that's kind of a big thing, and it's not. Yeah, I don't want to say we'll say merely outcome dependent. I want to say it's first order versus second order effects as well. Like there's a lot wrapped up in it, right? Because again, faith isn't about the immediate thing that happens in the moment the way that you expect. Faith is it's going to be okay in the end, right? Maybe it's not going to work out. Like maybe I'm going to lose my family, right? But maybe I'll get a different family later, right? Or maybe me losing my family will afford something for somebody else somewhere else that will redeem, right? Or make that loss better in some way. And then to loop this back into what you were saying, Teo, the analogy I was using earlier was people who have a crisis of faith start out sort of like on top, right? They're up on top of the well, and then they fall halfway down, right? But they started out on top. And so falling halfway, you know, I mean, yeah, look, you're headed towards nihilism, not good. People in a meaning crisis never were out of that well. They don't know a world outside of that well. They don't understand the concept of faith that I just outlined. They don't get any of it. They're halfway down the well, and they fall halfway and they hit the bottom. Like they hit the nihilism. And it's, you know, I think you said this earlier. It's not only more severe, it's quicker. You have way more time to catch somebody in a crisis of faith than you have to catch them in a meaning crisis. Way more time. And you also mentioned, I believe, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure, that you have more tools. Like there are more grab holds for that first half of the well.
In the faith
There's
crisis,
more
yeah.
things sticking out, right, that you can use. And those don't exist with the meaning crisis people, in my opinion. I think that's the problem.
Yeah, two things. Sorry, Manuel.
I want to add something first. Like, I think it's important that when we're looking at faith, we're doing things because they're good in and of themselves, right? So there's an inherent reason to doing things. And so that disconnects us from the results, right? So we get, and like it was even in Mark's framing, right? Like, and he's kind of pragmatist, right? We try to connect things back to reality and to actuality, well, like what we're experiencing now, and like I did this and therefore this happened, right? But with faith, right, you're doing things because they're right, right? Like, and in some sense, it doesn't matter what the ripple effects are, because you're doing the right thing, and we cannot predict the ripple effects of our actions. Like our actions are gonna have effects in the world, and like we don't know what those effects are gonna be. So it's also in some sense a relief to step away from taking responsibility of the ripple effects and do things because they're right. And like, I think that is eventually the only way that we can correctly make decisions, because if we start predicting the consequences of our actions, we're going to get sucked into holes and we're never going to solve that problem.
I think what I both you and Mark saying is what my Christian upbringing has drilled into me as God is good all the time, God is good. And I think that's the definition of faith that I'm also working with. It's the people in the faith crisis. I think you did explain this, Mark, because this, I'm turning very vague here with the hand gesture. This is the people here, the faith crisis people. They've got knowledge of the good. They've got knowledge of a potential good. Like there, even if they're on their way down to maybe not, but they were at some point up the well, knowing that there is a good, or being told that there is a good. Even if they didn't believe it, they were told that there is a good. The people in the meaning crisis have no concept of good, and which results back to what you were saying earlier, Manuel, where eventually they blame the world for being bad and corrupt, and it's just the state of the world is bad, and that's the state they're in. And I think this is a good. It's not this. It is this. You're right.
Well, and also, what kind of knowledge? See, and this is the real key. Like, this is why John Vervaeke has a few, like 3 or 4, really knockdown punches, like just dead on things that I really love. What kind of knowledge does somebody who was in the church have, right? That the person who wasn't in the church have, right? Access to.
Participation.
Right? If you want to use John's framing, right? And what does he sort of indicate is missing from the world by just using the term? He's pointing at participatory knowledge. And that's why the people who are in a crisis of faith are easier to deal with in some sense, because they have a form of knowledge. I think actually,
is this sort of like memory of like riding a bike and having that? Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And so in the last video I released, which is on Jordan Peterson, his trick, which it doesn't look like it's going to get to 1,000 views, but it's getting close. It's over 900, right? Yeah. I actually go over this. Peterson's straddles those two audiences, right? Because if you look at the biblical lecture series, what he's doing is giving you a propositional reason through psychology and history to participate in symbolism, right? And therefore in church by extension, right? And also in the Bible.
I'll say to participate in the narrative, in the biblical narrative.
Right. In the biblical narrative. Well, look, I mean, you have to watch the video if you haven't seen it. Everybody should watch that video.
I think I've seen it, but I'm bad at detailed information.
History. Well, he dragged you through. He starts with psychology. So all this stuff is psychological. Oh, and by the way, there are these myths, and you can see the psychology in the myths, right? And then if you can see the psychology in your modern storytelling and media, so right, stories are important and they're linked to psychology. And then he dragged you back through history, all the way back to the Sumerians, and then back through Egypt. Why Egypt? Why would you stop there? There's so much rich mythology everywhere, right? Like Beowulf and all this stuff that's really connected to us. Because when you stop at Egypt, you can go into the Bible pretty easily, because Egypt and the Bible match historically. So now you're using a historical argument to bring people into the psychology of story, right? It's a trick. It's a magic trick. So now the Bible's important. Why? Because it's linked to psychology and history. So you're using two materialist frames and bringing them together to get people into the symbolic and religious frame, basically. Right? And that's what he's doing. He does that with the biblical lecture series differently, because he starts with psychological significance of the Bible. So maps of meaning is just really about meaning, obviously, right? But that's the pattern of maps of meaning. The pattern in the biblical series is, well, look, there's psychological significance to the Bible. So that's why you can revive your faith. Here's using science, the science of psychology, whatever you may think of the science of psychology, and I don't think much of it personally, right? But here's a science that you can use to re-inject your faith, right? To add in that propositional engagement that then becomes a participatory engagement in that whole faith. Because I don't think symbolism is something that you remain in propositionally. I think symbolism will eventually lead you to participation.
So when we're looking at what Vervaeke is doing, he's talking a lot about the flow state, and he's making some kind of like religious argument, kind of like, oh, like flow state is good, like you need to get into the flow state, right? Like, and what is the flow state? Well, the flow state is some sort of being mode, right? Like it's being in participation, whether it's rock climbing or making music or whatever, right? Like there's a losing oneself, right? And so that does one thing, right? It gets rid of the ego boundedness that we're all suffering from, and but it also shows that there's different things in the world than the propositional way of being, right? And the flow state is something that allows us to get a relationship of connectedness, right? But the problem is, right, like, well, we only have certain regions of our lives where we can get into the flow state, right? Like, so like I can only get into the flow states when I do my sports or when I'm dancing and I've taken drugs or something, right? Or I'm drunk, like then I can get into the flow state. But if I'm not there, like then I can't get there, right? And this is why these drugs are so important to people, right? Because they get them to places where they can't. And now I want to take in this question, right? Like, are we born with faith or are we encultured into faith, right? Like, I don't like the phrasing of enculturing, right? But we're educated into faith, I would argue, right? Like, there's a way in which we are shown a type of participation, right? Like a participation in the spirit, and that allows us to get a taste, right? Like we're getting this other modality, and then we need to revisit that over and over and over again, right? Like, so that's what a practice does. That's what going to church is, right? Like that's what practicing an instrument is, right? Like we keep going back to it, right? And the first we're like, well, press this button, right? And then this tone comes out or whatever, right? And then at a certain point you get this intuition, hopefully, at least if you're paying attention in the right way, of, oh, like there's this, when I'm moving my fingers, then things come out. Like when you learn to type, for example, like I can type without paying attention to what my fingers are doing. I just tell the words to my hands, and my hands are doing the thing, right? So that's a different relationship than consciously trying to see, oh, what is this letter, and like where's the letter located on the keyboard, and how do I press it, right? Like that's a different type of relationship. And so are we born in faith? No, we're not, right? Like faith is requisite for certain types of participation, and we naturally get into certain types of participation, but it's something that is universalizable, right? We can have all our participation through faith, right? And that requires us to inhabit a state of being that needs to be cultivated and needs to be understood in a certain way, but not understood propositionally, but it needs to be understood of what it is like to be a being that is in faith. And to get to that step is earlier. The earlier in life you go there, the easier it is, right? Because the skepticism, right, like all the patterns that you have cultivated in yourself to relate to the world, they're not there yet, or in the ways that they're there, they're severely malleable. And the more you become an individual, right, like you become separate from the world, the harder it is to get these patterns into you.
Yeah, and Teo, just to sort of, I don't know if we discussed this the last time we chatted or not, because I don't recall all the details. But again, the power in dealing with meaning crisis people, for me, what is the idea of participatory knowledge? Even though if you watch the Knowledge Engine video, I don't believe it's knowledge, right? That's not beside the point. Like, let's not ruin the trick, right? The trick is, I'm not saying that knowledge shouldn't be your highest value, because that's too far for them to leap, right? They can't. You're destroying their worldview. What do you mean knowledge isn't the most important thing? I've got, and that works for Christians too, because some of them are like, theology is everything. It's like, no, theology is not required to be a good Christian at all. The zero theology required. You can just live and you don't even need the Bible to live and be a good Christian. Like, really, right? And they don't want to hear that, right? They don't want to hear that. So you can't destroy the
Especially
worldview.
Protestants.
Well, you fired that shot, not me. So
Friendly fire.
Jacob will be happy. Yeah, I mean, but again, you can go to them and say, there's a type of knowledge that you do not have access to, or that you haven't cultivated, or that can help you make these connections in the world that can't be made any other way. And that's participatory knowledge. And that is why I think John and his talk about the practices, although I disagree with his practices and how they're conducted and where they're aimed, that's why I think that is actually his single most powerful tool to be using on people, is to say, have you thought about, have I introduced you to my Lord and Savior, participatory knowledge? You know, like, right? It's you know, and it's not, obviously I'm being funny. It's not that, but introducing that idea in a way that people can swallow it, doesn't destroy their worldview, but does open them up within their worldview without challenging their beliefs to the idea that there's other things that they can do in the world. And that's why I was reading to you a little bit of the Mark of Wisdom outline, right? Where we're like, here are the steps for getting these people from point A to point B and getting them at least to symbolism. And then I've got steps beyond that. But you got to get them to the point where they're engaging in symbolism before you can sort of move past that.
Okay. The trick, the participation knowledge trick, I like the sound of it, but it's always going to because I'm thinking about a particular person. There's a recognition that there's a need for participation, like that she would say, but it's what to participate in and how to participate. That's where the stuckness seems to be. Hi, Anthony.
Yeah, so I'll take that first. Thank you for showing up, Anthony. We'll let you speak in a bit. Well, the argument that I'm making is, well, you need to cultivate the skill of participation, right? So instead of worrying about what to participate in, first learn how to participate, get the discernment, right? Because there's a discernment that comes with your participation, and then you will be starting to be able to see good or right participation from wrong participation, right? Like, the second thing I would argue is that you need to participate in a community of people that you trust, right? Like people that are pointed towards the good. And then when you're participating in the community with those people, then they can point you at right and wrong participation, right? And like, if they're unable to do that for you, then you should start getting skeptical, right? Like, because like, do they really know what they're doing, right? Like, maybe they know what they're doing for themselves, but then they might not be able to help you, right? Like, that is a perfectly reasonable place to make a conclusion. It's like, oh, you're good, but like, you're not right for me right now, and I might be able to come back to you when I have more skills, for example.
Yeah, just getting them to agree that participation might be important for them to try, without saying participating in what, right? Or how to participate even. Just say like, well, and like Peterson does this with Clean Your Room. Like, he actually does this trick. What he does is he says, you can make your personal life better as an individual, roughly speaking, right? By just cleaning your room. And that gives you participation in the world around you, right? And so he's introducing you into participation with Clean Your Room. And then he says, he introduces you into symbolism by saying, oh, you can be part of a story. You can write your own story, right? Imagine you could have whatever you wanted, right? What would you have to do that, right? And what would you have to do that is actually the same as saying, what do you have to sacrifice? Because anytime you do something, you're putting your time, energy, and attention to that instead of drugs, porn, video games, whatever it is, right? Every single time. So that's a sacrifice without saying the word sacrifice.
Speaking of participation, Anthony and I both participate in an estuary, so we just jumped from one Zoom call, and glad to see you on, bro.
Hello. Yeah, I hope I'm not interrupting. You guys seem like you were in quite a good flow there. There was a lot of ideas flowing. So I had some questions earlier, but obviously maybe just listening to how it's going, I might pick up a bit more. But yeah, it's very
Shoot
interesting.
away.
So I'm curious with the word faith because I've got an understanding of what it means, but I'm suspecting it's not overlapping as much as how you guys are using the term. You gave a really good description from Mark about it's not about the second, third order effects. It's about doing it for its own sake. At least that's what I took away from it. I'm interested in seeing what Manuel had to say about faith.
Well, yeah. So, like, the way I look at faith is it's in combination with belief, right? So belief would be like not completely a propositional, but you can look at it propositionally, right? You say like, oh yeah, this is the boundaries, right? Or this is within what I'm participating, right? So you're like, well, this could happen, right? Or like if I'm driving, I need to pay attention to these 5 things, right? And then I'm a good driver, right? So that's your belief, right? And then your ability to cohere to that belief, right? Like that's based upon your faith, right? So if you're having a faith relationship that is healthy, you can get into the flow state while driving, right? And you're attending to all of these things and they're not in conflict, right? Like you know what to do, right? Like everything is going right. But then when you have wrong beliefs, right, and you try to enact those out in faith, now you start getting into conflict with reality, right? So now reality is objecting to you. It's like,
Yeah, you get some pushback from reality.
Yes, right? And then that means that you're misunderstanding, right? Like so like you might have the right dogma, right? Like so the dogma is like the words, right? That cordon off a structure, but your understanding of what the dogma means might be completely wrong, right? So dogma is not something that saves you or that allows you to have right faith, but it's something that can put you or your attention to the right place so that you can start participating in faith, right? But in some sense, a dogma is pointing beyond itself, right? And then it allows you to start having a type of relationship, right? Like, and then you should be living in that relationship, right? And so you should release the dogma at a certain point, and you should start relating to what is being pointed at by the dogma, right? And then that is the container of your faith, right? And that is your belief. And at a certain point, you will not be able to articulate your belief because it's ineffable, right? Like it is beyond, and you can only articulate aspects of it, right?
Yeah. There was a really nice quote, I can't remember where from. It was something to do with pointing at the moon and don't get focused on the tip of the finger up in the sky. It's pointing at something beyond that I can't actually touch it, but I can point at it and hope you can make the leap from the end of my arm to what I'm actually pointing at. So I think I'm understanding what you're saying there about dogma. It's got some use and guidance. And I think that ties in with what you're saying about participation. If you're just reading dogma on your own, there's so many different ways of interpreting it and applying it. Participating within a community, there's so much more communication that comes through that you can then integrate, I guess. And there was
well, and also I want to add 2 things. So the Catholic view on dogma is interesting, right? Because the Catholic view on dogma is, and I forget where somebody read this to me. I think it was Father Eric actually, but the Catholic view on dogma is basically dogma are lights along the path. Like the dogma are the lights. So they're used to guide you and keep you on the path, but you move along the path. In other words, you're moving past the dogma, right? But the other sort of concept I wanted to explicate a little bit more. So when you're dealing with faith, you're dealing with a container of a larger size. And what that enables you to do is to get out of this individualistic sort of, it's me and my relationship to the words in the Bible. The reason why you want to read the Bible with other people and not just by yourself. So
I'm really sorry to interrupt you. Just one moment. I'm getting an awful lot of roboticness. I don't know if it's just me.
Yeah, I think it's on you because I'm okay.
I might just leave and rejoin, but I'll just be 1 second. Sorry about that.
I don't think I'm a robot. Am I a robot? I don't feel like a robot today. Although,
Well,
maybe.
sometimes if you lose your connections, Mark, and you reduce everything to linear discrete.
Well, so the funny part is that's exactly what causes a robot in computers is the linearity and discreteness. So the reason why you don't just read the Bible alone is not just for the extra perspectives, right? Because that's important, right? But because it's not the more thing. It's not, 10 perspectives is better than 5 perspectives. Maybe it is and maybe it isn't, because sometimes 10 is too many and 5 is all you can handle, right? Or sometimes you can only handle 1. But let's suppose you have a book, we'll just call it the Bible for short, and that book has many interpretations for each, say, a line of the book, or we'll even say chapters. How's that? You can interpret any chapter. We'll say every chapter has at least 5 interpretations. Okay, you as you by yourself may get lucky and find the interpretation that you need in the moment, but it's way more likely that other people who have a perspective on you that you cannot have, not an option, right, would see an interpretation and have ready at hand, or at least 1 or 2 of them, that would be beneficial to you, because you in the moment can really only deal with 1. And you may object and say, I can deal with all 5 or 10 or 50 because I've got a super brain. How's your brain when your parents die? Have the same brain, same capacity? Can you see the same world? What about when you're depressed? You seeing the same world? Does your brain have the same capacity? Do you have the same memory? Can you do 10 things? I don't think you can, kid. Like, I think this is not an option. And that's why you need other people, because you're not stable through time as the ultimate brain of the universe that can take in 1,000 propositions and sort them instantaneously to form the super idea. It's not going to happen, right? And that's why you need other people. And that's why you need not only their perspective on the text, but their perspective on you and their perspective on your relationship to the text. Because sometimes you can only handle 1 interpretation, and they need to give that to you because you can't get it for yourself.
Oh, that was very well described, and I'm getting a little bit of the distributed cognition idea, but the way you explained that was fantastic.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I'm getting through to people, because, man, I'll tell you, Teo, until you came onto that stream and we had that conversation, I was like, I don't think anybody understands any of this. I think I'm completely wasting my time. But then you saw it, and that was beautiful. So yeah, thank you.
So that's interesting that you bring up this distributed cognition, right? And I think if we're looking at people in a meaning crisis and people in a faith crisis, right, like their relationship to distributed cognition is different, right? So what is I've been thinking a lot about authority, right? So authority is that which justifies effectively, right? Like I'm doing this because of whatever, right? And that might be a material thing, right? Like it might be an institution, but it also might be a past experience, or it might be a religious tradition, or a cultural whatever, right? Like there's a justification, right? Like something that makes an action right, and like some people have a relationship to the things that make their action right, and some people don't, right? So like people who have a philosophy, right? Like they're using that philosophy as a justification for their actions, right? So now it's like, oh, I want to be a good person. Well, what does a good person do? Well, a good person helps people, duh. And then they go, well, how can I help people best? And then they get into this utilitarian attitude, right? Like we need to optimize the helping. And obviously the way that we're helping is by sending money to people so that other people can do things. And like, I don't have to participate in the doing. I can just provide the money, and I can have the feeling that I'm participating, but I'm just sending this money. And like, as a consequence, you might be doing good in the world, right? But you're not becoming a good person, right? Because in order to be a good person, you need to have the feedback from the world and have the participation and all that stuff, right? And then we go back to this concept of time, right? So like, that might be okay to do that for a year, right? But like, what if you're doing that for 10 years, right? Like, now you're getting so disconnected from the world, from your participation in the world, and how can you have discernment at this point? Like, how do you know what cause is right and what cause isn't right? And like, there's this interconnectedness, right? Like if we're just going to send food, right, like in Africa, then we're going to have a problem over like 50 years, right? Because then we're going to have a bunch more Africans, and we're going to have to resolve that, right? So you need to educate the people, right? Like you need to have a bunch of things that come with that, and you can't just provide one aspect of one person's life and then expect all the other things to magically correct themselves, right? And I think this is what the Christians are thinking in relation to the meaning crisis, right? Like, if I just provide this one aspect that they're lacking, then all the other things are just going to magically correct themselves, right? And we're not living in the world that things are magically correcting themselves, right? Like, we have to identify them, we have to cultivate a relationship to them, and then we can get into right relationship. And that is a process that takes time, and it's painful, right? Because like, people don't like to change. Right? And like, this is why it's hard to connect to these people, right? Because like, you're going to confront the way that they're living, the way that they're understanding the world, and you're going to say, well, you're effectively wrong, right? And the only way that you can do that is by letting them have a taste of the better.
Well, and also it just occurred to me, Manuel, when you were talking about distributed cognition, the way in which a materialist interfaces with distributed cognition is consumerist. They consume education, which is propositional training. Roughly, I have a video on education versus training on navigating patterns, just saying, right? They're consuming that, right? It's not generative, right? And then they're trying to take their consumption and make amends for it through paying for charity, basically, right? And that's the problem, is that the relationship that Christians have, or religious people in general have, with distributed cognition is in participation, because they're doing the book club for Jesus, as I like to call it. They call it, the Bible study. Book club for Jesus.
Book club for Jesus. That's good, bro.
Better marketing. Come on, marketing matters. Marketing matters. So yeah, you got to do book club for Jesus, right? Because now you're participating with something, right? And then you've got to get in community. But in order to do all that too, you have to break this consumerist materialist framing, because everybody who is a consumer has the option to also not be a consumer in some way, right? Like, you're not going to not eat food, for example, right? But you could also grow food. And maybe you don't eat the food you grow because you help out on a farm. But are you a consumer if you're helping out on a farm? I mean, you're still buying things. You know what I mean? Like, and materialists don't have a world big enough to hold multiple identities. So they're just like, well, everyone's a consumer, and therefore Karl Marx is right. And it's like, Karl Marx is an idiot, and everything he said was completely stupid. And if you don't see that, you're using a very simple lens on the world. Like, and that's the problem, is they're using a very simple lens because they've been told they can understand everything alone by themselves. And you know what you're not smart enough to do? I'm not smart enough to do. No one is smart enough to do, is understand even a small sliver of the world alone by yourself. You just don't get it. As much as I know about computers, and boy, do I know a lot about computers and the internet and networks and all that stuff, I'm sure there's twice as much stuff to know about, right, that I'm just never going to be able to engage with, because I have a limited cognition. I'm spending all my time working on meaning crisis stuff, right? And eventually you forget things, right? I mean, there's so many reasons why, right? And there's just some things I can't wrap my head around at all, because everybody has limits to their cognition, and everyone's cognitive limits are different. Not only are they different in totality, they're different in area. Some people like Sally Joe, she immediately, long before I met her, saw the difference between what Vervaeke was doing on camera and what Peterson was doing on camera. And I didn't see it until she told me. Like she just has a cognitive capacity in something that I don't have that cognitive capacity to that degree. On the other hand, Sally Joe doesn't know how to talk sometimes. And so my articulation is way better than hers, which is a low bar, because I mean, sometimes she's pretty can't understand what she's saying. And artists are like that in general, right? But these are different types of cognition. And we really don't appreciate how varied that is and what impact that has, not only on us, but on the people around us. Because it's very jarring, for example, to go and talk to people and then they are sort of treating things as a crisis of faith when you're trying to fix a meaning crisis, right? And until somebody like Teo comes along and says, "Oh, I see exactly what you're talking about. There's definitely two different groups of people here," you don't have an appreciation for the fact that you're right. Because if you're the only one seeing it, you could just be crazy. So, and that's an accusation that gets leveled at me on a regular basis. So I always have to be careful, because I'm sure sometimes I'm crazy. Like, there's no doubt about that. I'm not right about everything all the time by any means. So we have to have an appreciation and a humility for that.
I watched your video, Mark, discussing the conscious, just your video on consciousness, and you're picking out the fact there was no conversation about the unconscious, and just understanding consciousness without talking about the unconscious is futile. And I think that sort of applies to the people in the meaning crisis. I think it was you, Manuel, or one of you said that they don't have the capacity for more than one identity, and that fits into it. But I think they do participate unconsciously, without recognizing it. And is there a way to awaken them to the participation they're already engaged in?
Yeah. So that video is consciousness, unconscious, and dead matter, right? And you need the three categories in order to understand the world. And I think the problem, I mean, the reason why everyone's a pantheist, roughly speaking, nowadays, and even half the Christians, I would argue, certainly the Christians who are having a crisis of faith, is because of the materialism. And what that leads you to is again, you've been told you can understand the world in some fundamental fashion that is just beyond your personal capability, right? And so you're not outsourcing or distributing that cognition to, the government, to your community, to your state, to the people that are in the other groups that you have things in common with, like computers, for example, right? Like, I don't know everything about retro computers. I got to talk to people who know about retro computers to, know those things. Like, there's no other way. And that's okay, right? But because you don't have the sense of the three buckets, you end up just thinking everything must be some gradation of consciousness. And therefore the whole universe must be conscious, including all the rocks. And that's why I said, no. There's dead matter and there's unconsciousness. The most effective way that I have seen to get people to understand that there's unconsciousness, and it's not terribly effective. So I'm not claiming like 80% efficacy rate or anything crazy, is to get them to engage with not even necessarily meditation, but people used to ask me in the old days, like, "Mark, how do you judge a man?" And I'm like, by how long he can sit quietly with no distractions and stare at a blank wall. You go try and do that, okay? Most of the people I've ever talked to and mentioned that to are so terrified they won't even try it. That's because they know unconsciously they're not going to get away with that. Right. And this is all over the place. Alanis Morissette, Jagged Little Pill, the album, right? She has a song in there where she does this thing where she just stops the music for like a second and a half or 2 seconds or whatever it is. And then she says, did you think about, right? Like, here's a list of things. Did you think about all these things? Because you probably did, because you were in the flow of the song, and then she breaks that flow and your unconscious comes flooding out, right? Because whenever it's quiet, especially if you're expecting it not to be, your unconsciousness flows out and you start to see, whoa. So meditation and getting people to understand that if you're actually in a stimulus-free environment, there's things going on in your head that you have no conscious awareness of, but they'll come flooding in. If you can get people to start to acknowledge that, the other way to do it is to just ask them, why'd you do that? You knew the consequences would be bad. Why did you do that? Right? And asking people to explain their behavior, it doesn't work for all types of behaviors, but for tons of types of behaviors, they sort of realize there's more going on. And then you can introduce them to the concept of the emotions. It's like, how do you think your emotions played into that? Right? What do you think about desire? Right? Those tactics seem to be helpful.
I have a question. So I'm someone who would struggle with sitting in a room that was blank with nothing to do. And one of the things that I liked about John Vervaeke, in contrast to Peterson, was he had specific lessons on meditation. But being such a distracted person, I went and did his first meditation thing. Wow, that was great. And then I just carried away being distracted. And in the back of my head, I should really try that again. But, you know, the wheels keep turning and I haven't gone back to it. And so do you have some advice on where to start, how to start? That issue of, I tried it once, it was great, I want to do this again, and then just never went back to it.
Right. Well, I mean that to me is Vervaeke's most powerful work, is that meditation series. I mean, I've often said, you know, he calls it awakening from the meaning crisis. That's a misnomer. It's awakening to the meaning crisis. The tools, the from, is the meditation series and the cultivating wisdom series. And what we did as part of that live stream, and I did it rather accidentally because it's just what I do online, we built a community. And then you wanted to show up because for lots of reasons. And I mean, you know, I don't think they fixed this. They had all the sits in a playlist on the channel. Like the last time I checked, they weren't there, but I've been told that they'll be put back. You can see the interaction in the live stream, and you can hear John say things, you know, which, you know, little self-promotion just because this actually happened. John says, I'm so glad Mark is here because Mark makes me feel like whatever, right? Like, so having people to do the meditation with makes a big difference, right? And we've got 2.5+ years still doing daily meditation on the Discord server, on the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server, right? And having other people to do it with, there's the accountability. And that's another thing, Teo, by the way, that you can use with people, is things like accountability work. How does that work? Like, if you're always conscious of what you're doing, why would it matter if somebody else were there to remind you or to talk to you or to tell you something? Why would that make any difference if you were only a consciousness explains everything about your behavior? Why would accountability groups work? Why are you able to do more work at work than you're able to do at home sometimes? And why, how does all that work if there's no unconscious? And the unconscious, again, gives you a space for emotions. So meditation gives you a space to notice all that and manage it all. And the most powerful thing in my mind about John's stuff is he talks about the monkey mind, right? And that's like, oh, I have a monkey mind. What's up with that? Like, why are my thoughts jumping all over the place like wild animals, right? And it's like, well, yeah, they are, you know. And then he transforms the monkeys into puppies for some reason, but it works, right? He says, you know, you don't want to be harsh, you don't want to cage your monkey mind, you don't want to try to stop the wild animals from being wild, but you do want to encourage them like little puppies. Oh, over here, right? Because you want to befriend them.
So I think one of the important things is, why do we do things? Well, we do things because we assign them importance in a way. And when we're talking about meditation, like how can I do my meditation or whatever, it's like, well, why is it important to do meditation? Like, is it important because you want to try it out? Because like, if I want to try meditation out, like that's not a good reason for me to do meditation, because I want to try out like a bunch of things, right? Like that's not a valid reason to do meditation. But if you see meditation as like an existential need, right, or prayer for that matter, right? Like if you say, well, I need to get awareness of who I am and the way that I work in order to work the way that I think I should work, because I think that is true, right? And like whatever method you're gonna use to get there, that's secondary. But like that, I think that principle is true, right? Like you need to know what the tools are that you're working with in order to use them correctly. And like it is of primary importance to have a relationship to these tools, right? So if you're now going to meditate and you're like, well, like this is my method of getting a relationship to these tools, then what you're doing is completely different than being the consumer of, oh yeah, that would be nice to try that out. And that's how you can hold yourself to account, right? It's like, well, I've decided that this is important to me, and like, why am I not doing it? Right? Which is also part of what you're trying to figure out with meditation. Okay, like there's this process, like I decided that this is important, and I'm not doing this. Like, what's going on, right? Like, and whenever I feel resistance in me, I'm like, oh, hey, that is interesting, because there's something I don't know about, right? Like there's something in me moving me that I don't have vision upon, right? Like I don't have a way to place it. And then what are you doing in meditation, right? Like are you in there for the long haul? Like is this a thing that you committed to for at least a year, but like better said 10 years, right? And like therefore you're gonna act with faith in relationship to the meditation. You're not going to go in there and say, well, like in a month this needs to happen, but like, because how would you know what needs to happen for you and how it is going to happen, right? Like how would you even be able to judge whether it is happening or not? Like do you have a good way to understand what is supposed to happen? Because I don't think you do, right? So there's all of these things like, oh, like I'm doing this for this reason, and like I make a commitment, I'm binding myself, right? Like who I am is now as a consequence of what I'm doing, right? And that's what religion is, right? Like Vervaeke talks about religio, which is binding, connectedness, right? Like when you bind yourself, which is giving your word, right? Like it's signing a contract. It is participating through, right? Like seeing yourself through the eyes of, right? Like if you're married, like you're walking around and you're like, oh, this would be nice for my partner, right? Like that's what's happening. So you're an extension of their cognition, right? Or their agency in some sense, right? And every relationship that you're committed to has that quality, right? Like the way that manifests is individual for each person, right? But there's this quality, and so when you start thinking differently, right? Like I think all of these things are religious, right? Because like they're spiritual aspects. Like, I'm binding myself to this thing. I don't know what the result is going to be, right? Like that's like, why would you ever do that? Like that's the most ridiculous thing ever, right? Like because you're selling your soul effectively, right? And then, well, what is the argument towards that? Like you're selling your soul anyway, right? And you got to pick what you're selling your soul to, right? Like, are you selling your soul to your job? Like, are you going to sell your soul to your family, or are you going to sell your soul to this principle that is going to hold all these other things in a way that you can have healthy relationship to them all, and allows you to be a healthy agent so that you can do more, right? Because that's also part of it, right? Like if you're in right relationship to the world, you're experiencing less frustration. And if you're experiencing less frustration, you're going to be more efficient. In what way that's going to happen, like who knows? But it is going to happen.
It's funny because like that reason you've just given for the why, I think the why is very important because Anthony, like you and I talk about this, like we have very similar problems with focus and things like that. And I think I don't know if it was on stream or on Discord, but I told I said about my friend speaking about revival, the same friend was speaking about fasting, because I don't know if it's in America, but in the UK, most churches start off the year with like 21 days fasting, 7 days fasting. And she was out saying that she can't find the motivation to actually go through the fast. And I gave a similar um similar soliloquy to what Manuel just gave, which is the why is important. If you're just doing the fasting and you say the fasting as starving myself, whatever it may be, then you're gonna do it and not gonna find motivation in it. But if it's tied like existentially to your relationship with God, the good, the reality, use whatever word you want to use, I don't care. But just tying you to if the purpose of the fast is for right alignment with God, is the word I use, then you find better motivation. And it's when those like times when you're like, oh, I shouldn't, more you've got more ammo in your arsenal to fight those battles with.
Yeah, exactly. And it is that the problem with doing things and materialism is that in the material world, you start from you and your perceptions, and you make a single connection that is linear, it's a straight line, and it's discrete. It's a one-to-one sort of a thing, right? It's distinct from all the other connections. And then you expect that to behave reliably, right? And so why would I fast? Well, fasting in the material realm means I don't eat. It's like, well, yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all, right? But when you look at it from a perspective outside of yourself, what are all the things that fasting may afford me, if you want to use Vervaeke language, right? What are the affordances of fasting? Well, one is weight loss, right? Potential weight loss. The other one is, with or without weight loss, better sugar control, right? You're less likely to get diabetes, or if you have diabetes, you can reverse it with fasting. Little known fact: you can just fast and reverse diabetes. It'll be type 2 diabetes be gone, right? So the other thing is, it allows you to participate in privation, like to participate in not having something that you're used to having, right? And so there's a struggle there. So the skill of learning to struggle is a skill we need more of in the modern world, because we're too affluent. We're too comfortable, and we don't know how to be uncomfortable. And you can imagine, if you don't know how to be uncomfortable in your food intake, that maybe some of those skills in being uncomfortable with your food intake also relate to how to be comfortable in a conversation with somebody you disagree with. Like maybe those skills are, John would call them exaptable, right? Can be exapted from one to another, right? What else does it afford you? Well, it also affords you some time, right? Instead of eating, to contemplate not only your hunger and your struggle with your hunger, and the fact that, see, the other thing is, hunger is one of those things that comes out of your unconscious, Tail.
Mm-hmm.
So if we never have the, like, oh, if you could never fall in love and never be hungry and never want for anything, why do you care about the unconscious? Like, why should you even engage with it? It's not a factor in your life. And you can easily, as a materialist, fool yourself into thinking that there's no unconscious, because it never comes up. And you never struggle with it. You never struggle with hunger. So when you're hungry, and I've been hungry, I've been homeless, and yeah, it's not. When you're hungry, when you're actually hungry because you haven't eaten in several days or something, and I've done that involuntarily, and I don't recommend it. It's really not that much fun, but you get a clarity on the world that you don't have otherwise, and you're able to struggle with things that otherwise people who haven't had that experience cannot struggle with. Right. And you're also able to empathize with a bunch of people. Like, how do you empathize with starving people in Africa if you haven't starved, or starving people in India, or starving people in China, if you've never actually been hungry for real for days? How do you understand their plight? How do you have compassion for them? You can't. You can't. You don't know anything about their situation. But if you fasted for 4 or 5 days, because you got to get past day 3, it changes at day 3. That's when things get real. Now you can interface with people and have compassion for their plight, at least somewhat. Like at least you know kind of sort of something about what they're going through. But if you've never starved, to say that you understand what they're going through is just absurd to me. If you've never been homeless, it's hard for you to understand homelessness, right? And so there's all of these, and there's more affordances to fasting, but there's all of these affordances to fasting, but the why can't be you in relation to the thing, because it's one connection. And you need to look at it from the top down, from the emanation, right? Like, what are all the things that might happen? And they're not definites. Like, this is the discrete part, right? And the connectedness. They're not definitely going to happen. Some people fast and they're fine and they don't struggle through it at all. Like me post illness. Now that I'm sick, being hungry at 3 days doesn't really affect me the way it did when I wasn't sick but was homeless and didn't have food. Like, it's a different experience, right? But there's other affordances like the time, the contemplation time, right? That all those other affordances are still available, and they may not manifest. This is why you need faith. It may not happen the first 3 times you do it, but the 4th time it may be amazing, right? And that's something to focus on too.
So I think when we're talking about things manifesting, it's like there's part of why are you participating? Because you could say, well, I should be able to do this, right? And then you're effectively identifying against whatever reason that there is to participate, right? But you were saying, well, like, it allows me my connectedness to God, right? So what you're doing there is you're connecting it to a different framework, right? And like now you're trying to find intelligibility in a way, right? Like, so you're saying, well, this is important, this is important, this is important, right? And then you're having your experience, and then while you're having your experience, you're trying to find things in the experience, right? And when you're trying to find things, and like, well, how do you know what you need to find when you're fasting, right? Like, that's not obvious, right? And like even if you know what you need to find, like, what does it look like and how do you have a relationship to it? Like that's not obvious, right? Like, so there's a revelatory aspect to that, right? Where you don't have control over, like Mark was saying, like these things might not happen, right? Like, they might never happen. Like, there's plenty of stories in the Bible where there's people like they wait all their lives for things to happen, right? Like, sometimes God steps in and they get redeemed, but sometimes you don't get there, right? Like that also happens. And so, but like, what is your responsibility, right? Like, you're co-manifesting this potential, right? Like, so your responsibility is to be there in a way that you're having eyes to see and ears to hear, right? And part of having the eyes to see and ears to hear is not in your control, but part of it is. And that's what we're trying to get at with these practices, right? Like how do you get people to a place where they're listening and looking from the right place so that they can have the chance to see what they need to see?
I think
we've
very well put from both of you.
I think we've just stumbled upon what I think is what could be another really interesting tool to explore with the meaning crisis, because fasting is relatively known and it's demystified in a way, so it's accessible to them. It's not a foreign concept. It's not like praying. It's all different things. So fasting, and also like you both said, there is like an explorative nature to fasting. You don't know what you're going to find. You're not I mean, Christian framework for fasting does afford you the the right to be able to like go intentionally with a purpose to a fast. But like Manuel rightly said, that does not mean you get what you're going there for. Like, you very often will find very different things, and you have to be open to, like it perfectly said, eyes to see, ears to hear. You have to open yourself to what experience you're gonna find. And if we can trick the meaning crisis people to explore fasting, and let's see, and just go explore it, participate in it, and see what you find. And I think, Mark, you put up like a lot of very different reasons why you should explore it. But I think with we're doing the same thing. It's just we're giving proposition of reasons to explore it. We're just telling them why they should. There's still a missing piece of like I think that this is why Grim Breeze is a genius. The LARPing thing, you just have to live action role play it. You just have to get into it and LARP.
Yeah, and that part of that, Teo, is how do you know what will happen to you? And that's the question. That's the real question, right? Like, how do you because people will give you an answer to that. Well, I know that it can't, and then you can go into the, are you sure it can't do this? Are you sure it can't do that? Are you sure that's the only things it does? Because the problem with the individualistic frame is this flattening of the world, where they do kind of flatten it down to the degree that effectively what ends up happening is the people only see one relationship to the thing. They don't see other possibilities, and they only see it from their perspective in the moment, right? Not even,
in the moment.
Sometimes you can get them, right? Sometimes you can get them to see it in multiple perspectives, right? But they can't put it all together because they're stuck in their head. They're stuck in their framework. They're not understanding that this is why another whopper from Vervaeke is affordance. There are affordances. There are things that might occur that might be helpful to you, right? They're not definitely there, but right. And so explaining to people, you don't know what you don't see. And I know there was a dust up, years and years ago, right? It was Donald Rumsfeld who said there are known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and everybody was like, I don't know what that means. Well, there are unknown unknowns, right? At least from your perspective, there's a bunch of stuff you don't know that you have no idea about. You just have no idea about a bunch of stuff, and there's no way for you to have that. But because you have this individualistic relationship with the world, where it's just you and the world, you don't have the ability to explore. And again, one of the powerful things about the Vervaeke meditation series is that it gives you the ability to explore your relationship with yourself, me and my head, right? And then because we tend to use this 3 frames. I have a video on that, of course, on navigating patterns. Right? 3 frames, right? You with yourself, you with nature, and you with others. Like, there's all those aspects in everything you do. There's all 3 of those aspects are present. And so you can give people a sense, for engaging in that way, engaging with that framework, where there's 3 different ways or 3 different aspects or 3 different perspectives to consider for every single thing you want to consider, we'll say rationally, right? Or to your point, you can just LARP and find out what happens. You can just play the game and see what happens. And you don't want to confuse that with playing every game that you can possibly get your hands on, which people also, I have a video on that too, right? You don't want to just play a game to play a game, because you don't have to do that. But there's reasons to play those games. And one of them might be, boy, and I've said this in Vanderclay's channel, I think on my first talk with him. All the Christians I know, if you take them sort of on average, are much better people. Not just morally, but in their actual action and participation in their treatment of me, than the atheists are on average. All of the ones that I know. And that's a very mysterious thing, right? But I can see that. And once you point that out to people, who treats you the best, right? And this goes back to Peterson, be around people who want the best for you, right? It's these pragmatic little hooks that especially Peterson's really good at them, that get people into, oh, wait a minute, there's more to the world than I thought, right? There must be some reason why people are reading these stupid books and going to this book club for Jesus thing and hanging out together every Sunday. There's got to be some reason behind it, right? It's lasted for thousands of years. So even if you're a hardcore evolution believer, there's got to be something to it, right? And that's the thing to get them to consider, like, maybe there's something there. I think that's what Peterson does in the biblical lecture series in particular. Not meaning it's a different thing.
I have to put a qualifier at that, right? Because we were having this conversation with this guy who's been practicing Buddhism for a while. And then we asked him this question, right? Like, who would you like for a friend? Would you like a disagreeable person or an agreeable person as a friend? And then he was like, well, I need to think about that for a while. and so it's not obvious, right? Like, the people that we're in relationship with, like the immediate thing that people think of when good friend is like, well, are they tolerating me, right? Like, am I allowed to be me, the true me, blah, 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 right? So there's this aspect in the way that we're understanding what is good for us, where we're not thinking it through clearly, right? But he came back after a while, and then he was like, yeah, like I would pick a disagreeable friend over a non-disagreeable friend all the time, because they're gonna point out where I can improve. Like, if I don't have the signal, right? Like, if people are not gonna tell me what I'm doing wrong, right? Which is enablement, right? Then I'm not able to correct myself, right? I'm not able to correct my behavior, right? And so, what is the good, right? Like what do I see in the good? Like, is the good a thing where I can get what I want here and now, right? Which is, again, back to the consumer mentality. Or is the good the thing that allows me to live a fruitful life, right? And the allowing to live a fruitful life is sometimes burning off things that are not supposed to be there. And like that is painful, right? But having people who are willing to go through that with you, right? And then also point you at the right thing afterwards, right? Because you can burn something off, and then there's this gaping hole, right? Like, oh, I have this video game addiction, right? And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna stop playing video games. And now what? Like, am I gonna smoke weed, or like watch porn, or like what is the thing that I'm gonna replace that with, right? Like, what is my participatory skill with the world that I can appeal to replace this? Well, like, and maybe if I don't have the participatory skill, stopping my video games is actually not a good thing, right? Like just so that discernment isn't obvious, right? Like yes, it's not good to play video games, but it's maybe better than stopping. Sometimes, other times it's not better. Other times you should be stopping because you have this other thing that you can go to that is available to you. And this is connected to this progressive attitude where it's like, well, if we just cut away the bad parts, right? Like, if we just keep removing the bad parts, whether it's on a person or on society or whatever, right? Like, oh, you're racist, right? Like, if we just remove the racism, then you'll do the right thing. It's like, no, that doesn't work that way, right? Like, there's a reason why the person is racist, and you have to deal with the reason why the person is racist. You can't deal with the racism, because the racism isn't a thing. It's a symptom of something else, right? Like, the gaming isn't a thing. Like, it's a symptom of a lack of meaning in life, for example, right? A lack of the ability to connect, right? A lack of being in intimate relationship with being, with life. And so, yeah, like, and that requires a discernment, right? Like, that requires the understanding of the complexity. And like I hope the example gave you a way where it's like really easy to overlook these things, right? And that's also like, when you're helping a person, you gotta bind yourself to that person, right? Like, you gotta walk with them, right? Like, and you have to walk 2 miles, not 1 mile, right? So even if they ask you for one, you got to walk 2 miles so that you know they're okay, right? So that you know they're at the right place in their lives, so that they can fish, right? And they shouldn't be receiving fish from you. Like, they can do that themselves.
I'm just going to jump in 1 second. I've got to get going now, but this was a fascinating conversation. You put your points across very eloquently, and if you do another one of these, I'd love to join in. But I've got to get going, so thank you very much for having me and for your time, and hopefully I'll speak to you again at some point. See ya.
See you Saturday.
Good to see you. Yeah, and I think, Teo, too, you know, one of the things I'll say about Grim Grizz and his LARPing thing, although I think he just definitely takes it too far. Right? When you say LARPing, what are you saying? You're saying, you know what? Just play the game. Have faith. See what happens. Right. It's really an invocation of faith. He's just doing it in the gaming context, which I think is brilliant. I mean, a lot of what Grim does is brilliant, and that's certainly one of the things, right? And it's the universalization I don't like. But that's a different problem.
Yeah.
Right. When you talk about that stuff, you know, look, I mean, you can say, Set's reprogramming it. What's YouTube doing? Right. What's Substack doing? What, you know, like, it's the same problem everywhere. I think And I think one of the problems that we have is, to some extent, with meaning crisis people, you need to trick them into something like faith that they don't have an engagement with, or at least an understanding of. And that is the difference between crisis of faith and meaning crisis, is that crisis of faith, again, you can go back there. You're just having a crisis of faith. Meaning crisis, you don't even have a sense of faith. You don't even know what that is. You've never really engaged in the world that way consciously. You may have unconsciously. Again, why that video on consciousness, unconsciousness, and dead matter is so important, right? It gives you that. It re-enchants the world for you, right? It gives you that quality. Well, there's 3 qualities. There's a conscious quality, an unconscious quality, and then this dead thing that, whatever, right? And then they have different aspects and different ways of relating, and that's what's really important. And so when you're just saying, yeah, LARP it and see what happens, you're just introducing faith into somebody without using the word faith, which I'm a total fan of, right? I'm okay with that move. I agree with you. It's a good move. And asking people, are you sure you understand all of the potential, all of the possibilities, all of the things that might happen to you if you do this? Because maybe that's enough to get them to realize, oh, I guess I don't. And you can't just list them, to your point. That's not going to work. Like, don't fight the propositional with more propositions, right? But you still have to use some. And what I try to do is explain to people, no, your worldview sucks. Here, let me show you all the holes in it. And I just happen to have a talent for doing that, so I can get away with it, right? But it helps to show people that maybe there's more out there that they need to know, that they don't know. That's that call to adventure that Peterson does. And I don't know if you saw the Logos at Ephesus video. I saw that last night.
I've not seen it.
Oh, it's amazing. It's amazing. He doesn't add much, but the pieces he adds are devastating. And one of the things he adds is that call to adventure, the adventure of your life that's greater than the suffering of life thing. He really makes that point much better in that video. Much better. It's much clearer. And he gets emotional at the end, which is always good for Peterson, because I don't know why he does it just enough. Like, he's so authentic. He's so authentic, right? You can tell that's what's happening to him in the moment, for sure. It's not an act. And he really puts that together. Like, but adventure is an exploration. And so convincing people that there is adventure to be had, because if you live in a closed world where it's all economics, who cares? I could know all that stuff. It's boring. Like, why? There's no why in a closed system. There's no why in economics. There's no why in politics. You just know how it works, and you get to, right?
Well, or worse, you get someone to organize it for you, right? Like, I'm going to buy this vacation, and someone is like, I'm going to do this thing and this thing, and everything is planned out. Like,
you can buy closed systems all over the place as a consumer, right? But having a closed worldview, just like, why do I want to bother? Why do I want to bother participating in consumerism? Because it's an economic trap. And, well, yeah, if you were only ever a consumer, sure, but you don't have to be, right? And that's the part they don't know or don't believe, is that there's more to it. And if you can show them the more, then maybe they can engage in the LARP, and then maybe they can participate in the more, and then all of a sudden they'll really understand it.
But I think it's important to have the path to the more, right? Like, it's one of the things that we're facing a lot on the Vervaeke server is spiritual bypass, right? And like intellectual bypass, right? So there's ways in which you participate, like getting stoned, for example. It's like, oh yes, great, I get a means out of my framing, right? But now what? Like how's it gonna feed back into your life? Like, how's that going to allow you to become a better person, right? So there's this introduction in the possibility, right? And then there's the turning of the possibility towards the good, which is a way more difficult question, right? And like when you're talking about walking the 2 miles with someone, right? Like, you got to make sure that they keep walking with you as well, right? Like, it's not only that you have to make the commitment towards them, like, you don't want to lose them halfway, right? Because now you might have opened them up to a certain type of participation, right? Like, I think this is one of the criticisms I want to make to Vervaeke, right? Like, he's introduced a whole bunch of practices and things, right? But then it's like, well, like, how do you use them? Right? Like, what is the way in which you can use these practices to become a better person? And just relying on the magic of like, oh, we're going to participate in this thing and then good is going to happen. It's like, no, right? Like, if you say, well, it is allowing for good to happen where it wouldn't be happening otherwise, I'm saying yes, right? Like, that is completely true. But you can't put the goodness in the practice, right? Like there's a way in which there's a spirit, right? Like, you're invoking a spirit, and that spirit needs to be nourished, right? Like, it needs to be pointed towards the good, right? Because you can summon a demon, right? Like, you can summon a vampire, right? You can summon something that draws out the energy from you and captures you, right? Like, that's what drugs do, right? Like, that's what drug addiction is. You get captured in this energy of the spirit, and it's calling you back. It's calling you back, right? But instead of lifting you up, it's feeding upon you, right? It's feeding upon your finances. It's feeding on your social life. It's feeding on many aspects, and it's diminishing you as a consequence of that. And so the spiritual bypassing is a danger, right? Like, so this is why you have to have communal practices, right? Like, because when you have a communal practice, then there's a group of people, and the chance that a group of people that are trying to be responsible for each other, right? Like, that's the binding again, because that also needs to happen. Because, like, when you're just meeting once a week as a consumer group, right, and then you're not having a social relationship outside of the practice, like, that's not healthy either, right? Like, you need to be part of each other's life outside the practice as well as inside the practice in some way, right? And then you can get feedback from people, right? Like, when they know you, right, when they can see you change, then they can point at you and say, well, you're doing something, and that is allowing this change to happen, so keep doing that. Try to figure out the connection about what you're doing and how you're changing, right? And that allows you to get this discernment, like, oh, like, my participation is allowing me to do this. I didn't know that it was allowing me to do this, but because you told me, now I can start reflecting on myself, right? And in some sense, what is it? It's an unconscious participation that you're lifting up into the conscious, right? And when you're lifted it up, you can accept it, right? You can put it into practice into different areas of your life, right? Or you can manipulate it, right? You can play with it, say, like, oh, like, what does it mean? Well, like, what does it look like? How does it affect me? How can I change my relationship to it? And all of these things, right? Like, they need to be held in a practice, right? Like, because when I say this, like what does that mean? Well, like, do you have an understanding of what I'm saying? Well, I have an understanding because I'm referencing actual experience that I had, but I cannot explain these experiences to you, right? Like, the only way that I have an understanding is because I've lived through it, and so I can't convince you about these things until you've experienced them and you've seen how these things work.
From a two thing. Firstly, I think you're right about it can't just be, for example, estuary. It can't just be a consumeristic meeting once a month or wherever, and then you meet, you talk for a couple hours, and then you do it again after a month. There has to be a social aspect. There has to be friendship developed, and that was actually why I had to leave earlier. Is because myself, Anthony, and one other person from our estuary were planning social just to meet up and do things, and that's important. That also affords trust in relationships, and yeah, I think you're right on that. Secondly, I think I'm a Christian, so I say things up clear, obviously from a Christian point of view, and it's all of this practices, all of this the participation or practice that we've been describing today, the church has it and has it in abundance, but the way it's being applied and the way it's not emphasized, it's just a consequence of you know the propositions that you, the dogmas that you that you say. So again, I'm thinking about I'm a youth leader, so I've got this teenagers that I look after, and we've got a lot of them that are faith crisis. So like we said, that's a easier thing, but they're also bringing their friends who have no reference for church. To them, it's just a youth group. They don't even think of it as church. So they're with them, the reaching them has to be more participational, and I'm thinking of how to apply those tools that we're discussing in that context. So this has been really, really, really helpful.
Oh, good. Yeah. So let me add a little more flavor. I think that, and I do want to add.
Oh, hi,
flavor.
Shane.
Hi.
I want to add some flavor too to the idea of the of the meaning crisis, because I think it actually that if you get traumatized young enough in your life, so let's suppose you went to church till the age of 11 or something, right? And then you had a crisis of faith, we'll call it, but you never were developed to the point where you were interfacing with symbols and symbolism correctly. That looks more like a meaning crisis than a faith crisis, right? And so you kind of, there's a middle ground, right? And I think that's very much what John Vervaeke's in, actually. I don't think he's pure faith, crisis of faith, and I don't think he's pure meaning crisis. I think he's right in the middle, because he's had some church and he got traumatized. And he got traumatized in a couple of different ways that he's talked about, in various videos. And they're pretty, like, I was like, wow, well, that's pretty bad. Like, actually, that's pretty horrific to be traumatized in that way at that age. So I think that when you don't have a good basis, right, it's too easy to get stuck in this flat world, because the flat world is safe, man, because it's just, I do this and you do that and we're done. Like, there's nothing else to worry about. And it looks like autism to some extent, right? It looks like you're just using procedures to manage the world. And there's no, poetic navigation of the world. There's no potential to open up to, and when somebody says something, you jump on that, right? And that's loss of the poetic way of knowing, or way of informing the world, right? Which affects how you know things in the world. And that, I think, is part of this, the crisis of faith is very different from meaning crisis because of that. They have a framing where opening up the world can be full of awe and wonder, right? Whereas if all you've ever known is this, discrete relationship, and then you cry about something and it gets taken care of immediately, and your parents did that for you all through college, which is a very common occurrence nowadays, right? Then anything new, because you're not used to engaging with new things, is terrifying, right? It's horrible. Because there's something new out there. Well, then when you're on your own, Teo, you're on your own now, okay? And you're crying. You're out in the middle of, you've seen the meme, right? The woman out in the middle of the street screaming, and then nothing happens. And you're just like, what is this lunatic? And she's a lunatic. She actually has a mental illness. What are you doing? Why are you screaming at the sky? Why do you think that's going to change anything? But from her perspective, she's never learned to deal with change. She's never learned to deal with loss. She's never gone on a fast. She's never had to deal with the things inside her head or emotions popping up and changing her behavior. She's never engaged with any of this. And so it's like, well, yeah, now you don't understand the beauty that's there. You only see the horror. You only see the horror. You only see the possibility for horror. You don't see the possibility for greatness. And look, and Christians know this all too well. Like, go back to Job, right? Like, it could go very badly for you for a very long time, right? And so your faith may look misplaced for a very long time before it's revived or redeemed, right, or resurrected, right? And that's what. So that's what you have to give people is this positive affect, this walk. I mean, a lot of people in a meaning crisis can be temporarily held at bay. Like, if someone's suicidal and they're in a meaning crisis, hand them a box of stoicism, like, immediately. Like, it's like an emergency kit. Like, it's like an EpiPen, stoicism pen. Just hit them with that right in the heart. Just whack them with stoicism, because stoicism can give you some time, Because the problem with Stoicism is that it's wonderful and all. I love Stoicism. I'm Stoic, right? But I'm not only a Stoic, because that doesn't work. Stoicism gives you no why at all. At all. And they didn't need a why in ancient Greece because they had one, because they were all religious by our modern post 1530 standard. Look it up. Religion, 1530. Had a different whole connotation before that, right? They were religious. So adding a philosophy to a religion that's great. That's fantastic, right? It's when you try to have a philosophy only because you don't have a way to encounter the unknown that can be generative. All unknown encounters are horror, and none of them are awe and wonder and beauty. And that's and now you can't interface with the transcendentals, but you want truth because you're a materialist, and truth is definitely a material thing that you can hold, right? You see the trick we play on ourselves. Truth is something I can definitely hold on to. It's like, I don't know about that. And that's where the problem comes in. So just understanding where they're coming from and why they might be afraid, but also showing them. And I think this is part of where the recession of the church, part of where the churches have failed. They're not out there doing things in the secular realm, right? So like you can't join something like the Knights of Columbus unless you're a Catholic. Like you have to be in the Catholic faith already in order to join their little boys club. And it's like, well, you need a boys club before you're in the church that draws you into the church. And I think that's sort of what Vanderklay's at with estuary to some extent, right? Exactly. But I don't like that evangelization, that revivalist style is what I would call it. Being from the US, I call that a revivalist attempt. I don't think that's the right way to go for the meaning crisis people, which I'm not saying don't do it. It's great, do it. It's wonderful. It'll help everybody with the crisis.
Yeah, there was a question while I was doing the estuary leadership thing. It's the mixture of the deconstructed and the atheist in an estuary. How does that play out? And I've not encountered it yet, but I'll be interested to see how it play out, because I think that will, as a Christian, I feel protective of the deconstructor, because it's like you've got something precious here that you're trying to throw away, and I'm trying to help you not, break it all apart, just keep some things. But the presence of the nihilistic, materialistic person it's more likely that it's harder for the nihilistic and materialistic to see the good that the deconstructionist is throwing away, and it will be easier for the deconstructionist to see all of the bad that the materialistic is pointing to. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, so I think the framing that you want to use there is the materialist doesn't have the conception of being as good, right? Like in some sense, the materialist doesn't even have the conception of being as such, right? Because being is that which you participate in, right? Like it's that which you are unified with, right? Like the identity that you're assuming, right? So if you're using a utilitarian framework, right? Like you're not participating, you're taking, you're consuming, right? And like you're using things as a tool, right? And the tool is not an extension of you, but it's an extension of your wants or something, right? Like it's something that you can get things through, right? And so when you don't have the conception of being as good, right, which effectively means that when you participate in the right way, you can make something good happen. That's what being means good is, right? So why do you get into horror? Well, if you don't see a way to participate in the right way, right? Like it's like, then you have to have a whole bunch of things, right? Like you have to have an aim, you have to have a skill of participation, right? Like you have to have a whole bunch of other things in order to do that, right? Like so you can see other people do that, right? But in some sense, right? Like if you're watching ballet and like you've never done yoga or whatever, like if you don't have that relationship to your body, like you don't know what is required to do all these crazy poses and all these things that these people are doing. And even if you do, right, like these people are living their life that way. Like this is the same thing as the African people who have hunger, right? Like it is different to live in that than to visit it, right? Like there's still a difference, because when you're constantly in a type of hunger, right, like you're participating in a way of being that is now part of you, right? Like when you do fasting, it is not part of you, right? Like it is, you're partaking in it temporarily, right? Like and this is correct. Like we need to ritually partake in different types of participation, right? Like, so we need to participate in honoring, we need to participate in gratitude, we need to participate in observing the majesty, the glory that is bestowed upon us, right? Like there's all of these relationships that we have to have with reality, right? Like the manifest God, effectively, right? And there's all these relationships that we have to ourselves, right? Like we need to have humility, like we need to see all these things, right? Like, oh, there's ways in which I am blocking the right participation in the world. Like when I'm doing things, I'm actually preventing things from happening, and they're preventing the good from happening for me, but also for the people around me, and therefore I need to change, right? Like that is a profound realization. And you don't even have tasted the top of that iceberg in how many ways that is true, right? And looking back through all of these lenses at the world and at ourselves and at our community, right? Like that's what you do in church, right? Like you adopt all of these perspectives in a way, right? And you're guided by the Bible in what that kind of means, right? Like the dogma of having these perspectives. And then if we rotate to these perspectives, then we can start seeing, oh, like there's being and there's good in being, and there's ways in which we can extract or participate in that goodness in the being. But if you don't have all of that participatory experience, right, like if you haven't looked at the world in these ways, how are you going to see it, right? Like all you're going to see is you see the wall of reality that says no, right? Like I object. It's the objecting reality. Like you have your fantasy in your head how the world works, and reality says no. Like, and reality says no. Well, you're not going to get your ice cream, but reality says also no, because you're not going to get your marriage in the way that you want.
Right, but also, and I want to add a little nuance to this idea of deconstruction. Like, also, you need the framing. Like the reason why it's horror and not awe and beauty is because of the framing. If you don't have a frame outside of yourself, it's hard to see the potential for the good. Even if you think being is good, the crisis of faith, in my mind, is losing the framing, right, where goodness is manifestable by you. But the reason why that happens, to me, is part of this materialist, individualist, objectivist sort of worldview. I don't think, and I've heard a lot of these stories, I don't think anybody deconstructs out of Christianity. I don't think that happens. I've never heard a story where that happened. Every time somebody tells me the story about their loss of faith, they were driving a car and they took the wheel and they hit a wall at a high speed. That's what happened. They didn't cause that mess. They didn't cause it. They didn't carefully take one steering wheel off and then one wheel off while they were driving. Like, you can't do that. And I don't think they can. And I think when you frame it that way, you're trapping them and yourself to some extent, no offense, Dale, back into the materialism, the individualism. Like, oh, you did this. It's like, no. And the reason why I think that's important, and I might be wrong about this, but the reason why I think that's important is simply because you need to understand that there is a framework bigger than you, outside of yourself, right, that you can participate in to manifest the good. And if you don't understand that because you think you deconstructed and you can reconstruct, and what else do you need? Maybe you'll grab some Bible if you feel like it, or maybe you'll grab some Buddhism, or maybe you'll grab some scientism, and we can just construct it all ourselves. We deconstruct it after all, right? Which is a stupid argument because it's way easier to destroy than to build. But you can see my point. Like you can.
I see your point.
Trapped.
I see your point. I think the emphasis on, I think you're completely right. In almost all of the deconstruction story, it's they run into like something they didn't know was there. It's like, oh wait, is this how this works? I guess that means this is not what I think it is. So yeah. But I think there is the reason it's deconstructed is it affords them the agency that they walked away from it. Like they were on top of the world. They did, like, you were a part, you did participate in the good, and you walked away from it. So you deconstructed the potential good of it. Yes, they ran into the war, as you said, but you didn't evaluate what you ran into. You, like, the shock of it, the horror of discovering something new repelled you away from it. So it's like, it does, I think I get what you're saying, but I think it is important to like put emphasis on the, like, you made the decision, like you deconstructed. I know deconstruction, like I get what you're saying, like it's not exactly the right word because you didn't tear it apart, like you ran into something that you didn't see. Go on, Manuel.
Well, I want to reframe it differently, right? So what you did, right, is you have the light of God, right, like that's shining you, and it's like you're fixated on it, and you're staring at it, and you're being in the glory of God. And then you see this other light, right? It's like, well, what is that? And you look at it, and then it's like, wait, there's another light, right? And you just see all these other lights, and you're never looking up, right? You lose the looking up, and you're like, oh, right. And this is what these progressives all do, right? Like the newness, right? Like the excitement of the new experience, right? Like you get caught in this exploration. Oh, there's more to the world than I knew. Yes, like that. There definitely is more to the world than you knew, right? But what is happening is not that, oh, because I know more, like what was is no longer what it is or something, right? Like, no, your attention got caught and you got sucked into a rabbit hole, and at a certain point you didn't see the light outside anymore. Like that's what happened, and you were responsible because you took your eyes off the damn light. And
I think
you're not allowed to do that. Like
that tracks very well with the Christian frame. The Christian frame for deconstructing is backsliding, and it's like you said, it's the idea that it's not a drastic change of you just went, like, started destroying everything you once knew. It's a slow fade away and then you hit the wall. And then like after slowly fading away, then there's something that you're like, oh wait, this is it, and that triggers the deconstruction, or
you're
in my
the
case,
hole,
reconstruction.
Right, you're in the hole, and at a certain point, you're like, oh, there's no oxygen, and then there's like, oh, there's no light, right? Like all these lights that's been guiding me, right? Like they were only there as long as I was watching them, right? Like and as long as they provided newness to me. Like they gave me meaning, right? Or like a weak substitute to meaning. And then when I looked at what actually was, it all fell apart, right? And because I was no longer looking up, right? I no longer know how to look up, right? And because I felt the light disappear, how can I trust that one light that was like, how's that light different than all the other lights, right? And that is the question. And like people have to understand that they're in a hierarchy, right? Like when I was at the awakening, not awakening, from the Bridges of Meaning Discord at the start, right? Like there was this period where everybody was reading Kierkegaard, and I was just sitting in the chat, and everybody came in and they were all depressed, and they were like having these existential problems, and I'm like, first thing you do is stop reading Kierkegaard, right? Like, and then I can tell you, like, right, but don't do the thing that is pointing you away. Like, why are you staring into the abyss? Like, the abyss isn't going to tell you what's up there. You have to look up, right? Like, and all you're doing is instead of having the courage to look up, you're looking down so long that you feel that you're scared enough that you have to look up, right? Like that's literally what you're doing when you're on that path. And making it more complicated, like that's not helpful. Like you're just too pussy to face up to God, and you know what you've done wrong and what you're going to need to change, and you're unwilling to do it, and you're trying to find sneakily a way out. Like that's what's happening.
I've got more to say, but I want to let Shane have a word in because we've just been talking over him.
Hey guys, I gotta go. Thank you. So it's really yeah, you guys rock.
You rock. Yeah, Manuel, I think what you were saying reminds me of Peugeot's the way Peugeot describes worship and using attention as the currency for worship. I think it's a good frame because then you're responsible for what you attend to, and even if you're responsible for being conscious of what you attend to. And I think that goes to your point of like realize that you're reading an existentialist. Maybe that's having an effect on the way you're seeing the world in regards to the Kierkegaard Bridges of Meaning people. So I think that tracks well. But I think again that works great for the people in the faith crisis. Like it's an easier sell. This conversation is easier for the people in the faith crisis. So the meaning crisis people, it's a bit more challenging.
Well, but like if you're reading an existentialist, right? Like you're gonna have those experiences, whether you're in a faith crisis or in a meaning crisis, right? So you can still point at people at them, right? Like you're doing this, and your life trajectory has changed, right? And that's maybe the most important thing, right? Like, oh, I am on a life trajectory, right? Like there's ways in which I can conceive of myself where I have this relationship to reality, and that is influenced by the media that I consume. Like one of the things that we got earlier is what we had these maxims, right? And one of the maxims that we got on the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server is curate your signal, right? Like there was a bunch of people dealing with the Trump election stuff, and then the COVID nonsense happened, right? And all of these people, they got stressed out, right? Like it doesn't even matter on which side of the argument that you're on, right? Like everybody got stressed out because they were consuming something that was bigger than them, and they were emotionally connecting to that process, right? And like at that point, it doesn't even matter who's right. Like what matters is how you're affected, right? Like are you able to live your life in a generative way where you're pointing towards the good? Like is consuming this media helping you point towards the good, right? Like this is one of my criticisms that I have to this little corner of the internet, right? Like knowledge is great as long as you can point it towards manifesting the good, right? Like if we're in this Gnostic cesspool where we're just wanting to know things, right? We're wanting to do theology, we're wanting to do these things, and we can't make them connect back to our participation. Like, what are we doing? Like, I'm serious. Like what is happening? What is the thing that you're trying to manifest in the world by talking about this theology? If you can't connect it back to participation, and it doesn't matter whether you're right or not, right? Like I'm not making a right or wrong argument. I'm making a good or not good argument, right? And then there's all of these people, right? Like they're at the edge of their understanding, right? So they're receiving this information from people who have more participation that can ground the information, and they're hearing these snippets, and then they return to their daily lives pretending that there's going to be implications from this information, right? Like so Kierkegaard, for example, right? And now you're in this spirit, right? Like you don't know whatever spirit it is because it's above you, right? Like it's bigger than you don't understand it, and you're caught up in it, and you're like trying to participate, and reality says no, right? Like you're trying a thing and it doesn't work. So I don't think that's good. Like I actually think that's evil, Like I think there's forbidden knowledge, right? Like whether it's true or not. Some things should be forbidden for certain people to engage, because their engagement with them cannot lead to the good, right? And I think we have to be really careful, right? So when you're saying, well, like we need to provide people in a meaning crisis different things than people who have a faith crisis, because for these people, because they're lower in the well, there's forbidden knowledge. Like there's things that they can't engage with until they have the participatory understanding that allows them to have a right relationship to that.
I think
And
that's
starts.
perfectly said. I think that needs to be clipped.
And
Yeah.
this is the criticism I've been having on this little corner. And I hope that people start understanding this stuff.
I feel like most of the time I've engaged this little corner, there are people pointing to what you've just said, which is build, not just, this isn't the thing I like about this little corner. It's not just a YouTube channel for people to increase their viewership, increase their subscriber count. It's people encouraging people to go out and participate. So I think that's very well said, Manuel.
Yeah, and I think that's why we focused early on practices, right? What do you think practices are? It's participation with a group of people. I think that's what we push. I'm 2.5+ years, right? And that's the reason. Like we think that's the key important part, because and it's not a straightforward thing. You can't just say, oh, well, here's the books of forbidden knowledge, and here's the books of non-forbidden knowledge, here's the books of forbidden knowledge for people in a crisis of faith, and here's the books of forbidden knowledge for people in a meaning crisis. No. Everyone at any time has a different set of forbidden knowledge. And look, you can say forbidden knowledge is bad, right? Fine. You want to be a Gnostic? Let me just prove to you that this is a legitimate, real pattern in the world. Okay? It takes 2 seconds. You can't tell children the truth about sex. You're 3 years old. And if you did, no good would come from it. And that's actually a little rule that I have. I'm going to do a video on this. One of my little rules is, can good come from this? Because if good can't come from it, I try to avoid it. And I don't always know, and I make lots of mistakes, but I do think about that. I go, is this capable of manifesting the good? Because if it's not, I'm not going to do it, right? And I'm going to tell other people not to do it too, right? And that's context dependent, like everything else, sure. But you have to have that concept in order to engage with whether or not you're enacting the good, right? Or able to enact the good before you take an action. Because your time, energy, and attention is the only thing of any value that you have. So, you have to be careful where you put those 3 things. And so there's forbidden knowledge. And the reason why you need something like book clubs, or book club for Jesus, right? But book clubs, if you're meaning crisis people, because you probably don't want that Jesus guy at your book club anyway. He kind of stinks. He's how old is he? And I mean, he rose from the dead. It can't be a good smell with him in the room. So, like, I get it. I get and that's total materialist argument for sure, right? But the reason why you have that is because people can offer you the knowledge in the text. Maybe it's Plato's Republic that you need in that moment, right? This goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? That's required, and that's a good use of distributed cognition, right? There is these other agents, right, can help you. But also remember, the first part of my, I think it was actually step 1, right? The whole idea of the outline of Mark of Wisdom is clean your room. Why? Because that's participation that you can do, that you feel an effect on yourself, that you have total autonomy to do, that gives you discernment in the world. Oh, my room was dirty and now it's clean. And there's a difference. And that difference isn't in the room. It's also in my head. And that difference in my head also causes a difference in how I interact with the world. Now, you don't need to go through all those propositions. And Peterson is pretty clear about that. He just makes the statement and walks right on past it. And Vervaeke, to be fair, does a very similar thing. He said, you do the meditation and then probably you won't even notice a difference. But what might happen after a while is somebody says, there's something different about you. What's going on? Did you change, something? And then it turns out, I've been meditating for 6 months, right? And they'll notice before you will. These are good uses of distributed cognition because, as Pastor Paul Vanderklay says, we outsource our sanity. Yes, we do. And in order to outsource your sanity, what you need is an anti-individualist perspective. Because if it's just you and the world, and you as an individual walking around the world and interacting in a linear, discrete fashion with everything, there's no higher dimension for distributed cognition to exist, much less impact you. And there's also no higher dimension for your impact to manifest something good outside of yourself. That's why re-enchanting the world, re-inflating, adding quality back into the world, adding quality back into the, into the discussion. Like, okay, I get that, that if I make a widget and you make a widget and we spend the same amount of time on it, that should be valued the same. But what about the quality of the widget? What if I'm just a better widget maker than you? How does that affect how we should get paid? What if when I'm making the widget, I'm happy, and then that makes other people happy and they make better widgets or they make them faster? How am I supposed to get paid relative to you? Right? These are little tricks to break people out of the materialism and the economic framing in particular.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were speaking. I think that the two levels as well. I think Paul, I don't know if it's consciously. I think the God number 1 and God number 2 things address it, because before you get to God number 2, whichever one is the agentic one, I always get it mixed up. The arena God is the first step to get to for the meaning crisis people. And Christians, I've just been telling them about God number 2, and they just can't. They can't. That's scary. It's horrifying for them, because if you can't see good, and then there's this idea of a supreme being, you're basically expecting Thanos. Yeah. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and I want to support Vervaeke a little bit, right? Like, it's not a supreme being, but it's the being of the supreme footprint or something, right? Like there, and so there is a being quality to that which is the source of being, and it's really confusing, but it's important to realize that in some sense there's this disconnection, right? Like there's always this grasping to what is beyond the not fully being able to hold the good, and maybe that's even a good thing, right? Like then there's always more. Like there's always this extra thing that you aren't in yet, and then there's the quality of forgetting as well, right? Like the remembering is the bringing back into life of a certain relationship that you've had, right? And then the recognition, right? Like of the importance of having that relationship, and then that allows you to re-understand all the other aspects of your life through that perspective. And I think Mark wants to go to Ethan.
Yeah. So, I mean, I brought it up because you were talking right about what he was talking about, right? Ethan says the good can't be explained in words alone. It's very important to understand that when the good does appear in propositions, it's always qualified by the ineffable context, right? And it is again, it's re-enchanting the world for somebody is about adding the context into which you can have the good, the true, and the beautiful. And you can do that through beauty, truth, or goodness, and the discussions of them. It's another thing that John does very well, is he talks about his dialogos practice, which I don't particularly like, but he says you should always make it about, a transcendental, right? Or a value, or something that doesn't have an answer, because you want to get in the habit of talking to somebody without a resolution, but with an enhancement on both, like, oh, I didn't see that aspect of justice. Oh, I didn't see that aspect of truth. Oh, I didn't see the potential for beauty in that, right? And like one of the things I keep talking about, theoretically, I'm working on some articles, right? And one of them is beauty's not going to save the world. Why isn't beauty going to save the world? Well, beauty's not going to save the world because people don't understand. And Sally Joe talks about this with me all the time. The military parade is beautiful. The power of the military, all by itself, just the power that something like an intercontinental ballistic missile has, is beautiful. It really is. It's also dangerous right? So beauty is not always towards the good, right? True is not always towards the good. Lots of things are true and bad. Lots of things are true and irrelevant, right? In fact, most things are one of those two things. Very few things are true and good, right? Or worse yet, true and good and beautiful, right? Which is really, you need all three. You can't divide these apart. And I think that's one of the problems, one of my criticisms of Jonathan Peugeot. He talks about symbolism is that that's going to save the world. And part of our argument is symbolism is going to save the world for maybe the people who have a crisis of faith. But symbolism is not going to save the world for people who don't understand symbolism. And maybe you can get a few of them in, say, through the symbolic world. And I totally support the Symbolic World Project and absolutely everything that Jonathan Peugeot is doing. But I still want to make a space for the folks Vervaeke talks about, I think, the most eloquently, right? Which are these meaning crisis folks, who I call them the clueless. So the NONESs, some of them fell out of faith really young, right? But some of them are clueless. They never had a religion. They never went to church. They never engaged with any of it. They might have the cultural remnants, right? This is the Tom Holland argument of Christianity or of some other faith. Those cultural remnants may be there, and they may be using them and relying on them. But that doesn't mean you can put those pieces together with some cultural glue and suddenly they'll be in the religion. I don't think that's going to work. I think you need to give them the framing first, and you need to do that really slowly. And part of it is by giving them returning their own personal agency to them slowly in a way that and allows them to engage with something that allows their imaginal space, their imagination to build the potential for goodness. And then you can introduce them to the thing that might bring them to horror or awe, right? And then you can say, no, this could be full of awe and wonder, right? Instead of it's only horror because that's all I know about change.
Yeah, go on, Manuel.
Yeah, I wanna go to the good and the beautiful a little bit, right? Because I think when we're looking at truth, right, like it's effectively in accordance with reality, right? So there's in accordance with actuality, right? Like so that's a fact, effectively, right? Like this is or it is not, and then there's a way in which your participation can be true, right? Like so like the way that I'm in relationship to reality either works or doesn't work, right? So that's two types of truth, and you can look at one of them as materialist, right, and the other one is spiritual, right, or heavenly truth and earthly truth or something, right, whereas like, oh, the rock is there, but like the rock can be part of the foundation of the church, right? like that's two different
Very
ways.
poetic.
Yeah, but that's two different ways of seeing a truth in the rock, right? And I think there's the same goes for beauty, right? So we can have beauty in a military parade, right? Or we can have beauty in a stylish car, right? Like so there's a smoothness, right? Like I think beauty is related to the interconnectedness, right? So it is a qualitative statement about the intimacy in some sense, right? Like the participation of something in intimacy, right? But there's also the beauty of the army in that it is the thing that protects us from the evil, right? Like there's and that aspect, right? Like that aspect of the beauty, I heard, like I thought I was disgusted by the COVID policy, right? Like there was something that didn't taste right. Like that there's an emotional connection, right? Like where even if what happened was right, it didn't happen in the right way, right? And that's where beauty comes in. And then goodness is the thing that binds it, right? Like where it's connecting it to the telos, right? Like what is being manifested in a math equation, right? Like because a math equation can be good, right? Or correct is a better word, right? Like so you have the material correctness of a math equation that allows you to have right relationship, right? Like going to the right relationship, like or right predictive capacity or right putting reality into a trajectory, right? Like a model is better, right? Like, so it can predict what is going to happen, right? Like, so there's a goodness in the model, right? But there's also an immaterial goodness where the goodness is improving the quality of being, right? Like, which is effectively reducing the frustration of the interconnectedness or something. And so I think it's important to see these things. And I've been thinking a lot about this, right? Like, I hope that comes true, right? But even my understanding of what beauty is, or what truth is, or these things are developing, right? Like, and they're developing as a consequence of, like, okay, I'm trying to participate in experiencing these things. Like, what is the thing that I'm participating in? Like, what is it manifesting? And like, it's not obvious, right? And like I might be missing like a part of participation, or like there might be a part of participation that is completely closed off to me, that I'm oblivious to, that is integrated in these aspects, and therefore there's this whole quality that I'm not aware of, right? Like, and that's that. And I might be getting access to that, right? Like, maybe if I find enough humility, or maybe if I find enough receptivity and openness, I will be receiving a new type of relationship that will inform these transcendental qualities in new ways, right? And now, what do we have? Well, we have these things, right? And these things, they build up our experience, right? Like this truth, goodness, and beauty. They're ways in which we have our relationship to reality. And so when we get a more fulfilled picture of the way that we're standing in relationship to reality, then we can also develop our participation in that picture, right? Like, we can start finding new ways of being in relationship with ourselves, with the people around us, and therefore manifest goodness in new ways. And what am I doing? Well, I'm building a structure of participation, right? Like, I'm building a framework, like places.
Ecology of practice.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to manifest that through an ecology of practices, but I'm resting myself. Like, there's places where I can go inside my understanding, where I can look from, right? And that allows me to establish relationships to the things that I'm participating in, right? And now I can find universal means of participation. So it doesn't matter where I'm at. I can find these qualities, and I can try to discern them, and then I can try to relate to them. So I'm always participating in the good, at least as best I have as I have access to them.
Yeah, I think the notion that beauty will save the world. Shout out to Ethan. I think instinctively when I heard that, I'm like, oh yeah, that rings true. But that's because I'm looking at it from a perspective of where I see good, and instinctively beauty I link it with good. But you're completely right. Beauty is not uh it's not, like, for example, I was thinking while you were speaking about children, just everyone speaks about having children as this beautiful magical thing, but talk to a materialist living in a city and she will tell you that no, that is the worst thing to do. It's no, just not. And it's horror. It's, yeah. So I think you're right on that. And Manuel, I think you're completely right. The way to break that is, the only way is to develop these practices and to participate in the world in a way that affords not just the realization of goodness, but the realization that goodness is good, if that makes sense. Not just that it exists, but that it is good. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to start from that framework, and I think that's what people suffer from. And I see it with Peugeot, and I see it with Van der Klee, right? They have the pieces already, and then they're looking at the world and going, well, what pieces are really missing here? And then they're saying, well, the most important piece that seems to be missing is beauty, right? Or the most important piece, and like all the crazy scientism people, what do they think is missing? All the secularists, what do they think is missing? Conversation. It's like, well, it's not really conversation, it's good conversation. And then it's like, well, how do we have good conversation? Why would anybody think that? Why would anybody think that? It's crazy. Like, unless conversation is going to convince somebody of something, conversation doesn't do anything at all, right? And then what happens is we have more conversation, more conversation, more conversation, more conversation, more conversation, and everything gets worse. Why? Because the more we talk to each other, say openly and honestly, or at least as much as we're able, right? The more we realize we don't agree on all these things that we never talked about before. So the number of disagreements we have actually goes up the more we talk. And so if that's what you're, now this isn't a problem if knowledge isn't the most important thing and you have a faith framework, right? Because the fact that I disagree with you on things, Teo, and I'm sure we could find things to disagree on because I'm disagreeing, I can disagree on anything, right? Means nothing to me, right? What means something to me is that you're here in good faith, helping me from my perspective. I know you think I'm helping you. Ha, shows what you know. Helping communicate the message better, right?
Yeah.
That's what matters, is that you're here putting your time, energy, and attention into this project, which I also care about, right? And like Manuel and I, we have knockdown, drag out arguments all the time, still all the time, right? But it doesn't affect our relationship because I understand that Manuel has a really good heart, and you may have to dig to find it, and it may just not be there right away.
You have to dig me up from my grave to find it.
But it's there, and it beats occasionally, even.
I'll beat your ass with it.
But that's the thing. Like, it's not the propositions that we disagree about that are important. It's not the fact that the more we talk, the more I find out that Manuel's got crazy thoughts because he's a European and Europeans are all crazy, right? That's not what's important. And so the fact that that's there it doesn't do anything. It doesn't affect the goodness in the relationship because we're not focused like Protestants on all the things we have that are different, right? We're focusing on the common goal of enacting the goodness using the tools that we've sort of seen Jordan Peterson use, right? And understanding them using John Vervaeke's, science of meaning framework, right? That's the project. And then pushing that forward in a way that I would argue Peterson and Vervaeke and Peugeot and Van der Klee are not. Like, they're going in different directions. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with them going in different directions, right? But we have a specific audience and we think it needs to go in a specific direction. And we have a lot of backing as to why we think that, right? See, navigating patterns for more, right? And we're trying to do that. And we're doing a poor job at it for sure. But your engagement here is really helpful. And that's what's important. It's not important that we could find hundreds, if not thousands, of differences if we really felt like it.
Yeah, I think.
Hold on, I want to add something to that, right? Because why are we doing a poor job, right? Last time that I was on the live stream, I shared my frustration, right, with finding people's help, right? And what are we talking about, right? We're talking about embodying, right? We're being the vessel, we're being that through which goodness is manifested, right? So you can't make a framework and just pop people into the framework and expect the good to manifest, because that's not going to work, right? You need to work with people, right? And you need to tune in to the way that they have a relationship to the good, and then you have to give them the tools to manifest that good to other people, and that's what we need to do, right? Now we can have some universal aspects, right? For example, the Bible, that's pretty good tool to get a relationship to the good, right? It's been successful for a long time, but so there are aspects where you can have that thing, but reading the Bible is not going to put you in relationship towards the good. You need more. You need the tradition, you need the cultural cognitive grammar that puts you in relationship to that Bible in order to manifest the good that is inherent in the Bible, right? There's an inherent goodness, right? But the goodness needs to be embodied, and it needs to be put in relationship to the here and now. And well, what was it? Yeah, like, so I wanted to comment on this. Like, it's impossible to receive the beauty and goodness. Well, like, well, maybe it is possible to receive, well, at least close to all the beauty and goodness, and that's what makes you a saint, right? Like, it doesn't make you God. It makes you have right participation and right sacrifice, and you will manifest something in reality that is gonna be awesome to other people, right? Like there's, if you have this universality of right relationship, people's eyes will be opened. Like you will connect to their subconscious understanding of the good in such a way that it will be brought into the light. Like that's what sainthood is, right? Like that's why it's important. Is it's drawing people out of the darkness as a shepherd to have new relationship and be their own vessel towards goodness.
Yeah, and you wanna give them the reason to engage, and then you need to give them the tools to engage. And I think that the strength of Peterson is giving that psychological science, right, and that historical sciencey or materialist reason to engage. But the failure of Peterson, I would say, if he has a failure, and I don't really like phrasing it that way, is that you still need the skill of understanding symbolism, right? And I think where he does his best is in Clean Your Room, right? In the pragmatic, what you can do, clean your room, the future authoring program, things like that, right? The writing stuff. That's definitely really important and where he does his best. But he doesn't do well with the why, because I don't think he has one himself, right? Other than, oh, there's more to the world, right? It's curiosity. It's not a draw out, right? Whereas Vervaeke does a better job of talking about aspiration, but I think he does a good job about giving you tools, like, because meditation starts to give you the tool to have more self-control, for example, and to have more awareness of yourself. So that helps to enhance your, three frames: you with yourself, you with nature, you with others. That helps that frame. And then he also gives you some other tools in that frame that help you nature. Oh, you can savor nature. There's a savoring practice, right? Oh yeah, okay, that's in the Cultivating Wisdom course, not the meditation course, I think. But there's a way you can savor the things around you and understand how you're connected to the things on your desk. Like, this was a gift from my friend years ago. Went to India and brought back a hand-carved wooden elephant for me and gave that to me as a gift. So I remember that connection, but I'm savoring nature, my environment in this case, right? And so that's a set of skills. So you need the why and you need the set of skills. You can't just fly by on an airplane and drop a bunch of Bibles and go, ha, I have cultivated people into the faith, right? And again, that may work better for people in having a crisis of faith, but that's just gonna hit the meaning crisis people on the head and make them go, oh, this religion stuff is terrible. It hit me on the head and I hate it.
Yeah, I think I don't know why, but I clearly see the need for your project. But I also associate your project with like the Vervaeke corner, which is probably appropriate, because that's what I saw Vervaeke doing. I saw Vervaeke reaching providing a framework for people who the people in the meaning crisis, and the bridging the gap between faith crisis and meaning crisis. I think you're right that it's gonna need to involve all of the tools that Peterson brought to the table, like to give them the psychological engagement with the Bible, maybe, but at least with knowing that there's maybe literature that can transform you, for example, because just knowing that can be a good start. And Vervaeke, I've not engaged a lot with Vervaeke tools. Anthony, who was on, he's watched he's been through the Meaning Crisis series like 5 times and he's seen all of Vervaeke videos. So he's it's it's nuts. It's like the Vervaeke expert. But I think it does seem to provide a lot of practices that would be useful. So yeah, like I say all that to say, the project you guys are the way I understand it anyway, I think it's very needed. And for my not so secret Christian agenda, I just see this as another slippery slope to Christianity. So hey, if whichever way I can participate in help, happy to.
Right. So that's the best arguments I can have for Christians, right? Like Paul said, all roads lead to God. I'm like, no, not all roads lead to God, but a subset of roads lead to God, right? And you just have to get people on the subset of roads. And well, what were we talking about at the start, right? Like there's this pot or this hole that people fall into. Well, what do you need to give people? Well, you need to give them a ground to stand upon, right? And so when you say, well, like, oh, this psychological way to understand the Bible or whatever, right? It's like, okay, there's I'm not trusting, right? Because we're in the realm of trust, unfortunately, right? Like I'm not trusting this relationship, so I need to have a trust relationship from which I can re-engage with the things that I disengage from,
Yeah.
right? And then when we're lower, right? Like we have less integrity, right? Like the way that I understand integrity is interconnectedness, right? Like there's a stability by having interconnected relationships, right? Like when you have a triangle, right? Like the fact that they're organized, or you have a pyramid, right? Like when these things are organized in a certain way, they give stability to each other, right? Like there's this fixation, and that fixation is the thing that you can trust, right? Like that is the thing that you can stand upon, right? Because my problem was always, and this is when you're at the bottom of the well, like when you're at the bottom of the well and you're looking up and you're saying, well, okay, like I want to build my castle, right? It's like I'm gonna have to build my castle in the sky, right? Like so I'm I'm gonna have to go to a cloud, and I'm gonna have to put this beam, and I'm gonna have to put this other beam, and like what am I gonna build? Like how am I ever gonna trust anything I build? Like it doesn't matter what I build. Like I need to build something, and how am I gonna trust it? Well, the way that you trust it is by it's having integrity, right? Like at a certain point, the thing what you build, however you build it, works, right? And if it's true, you can make it bigger, and you can make it more interconnected, right? And
Oh, what's happened? Am I still on?
yeah, you're still on. We're past the 3 hour mark, and
I
so
don't know what happened.
we're
Oh.
getting canceled mid building a castle in the sky. So, but to go back, right? Like, so you're able to build, to expand what you've built, right? And you can connect new things in the world without conflicting with the integrity of what you're building. And if you're doing that, then even if that's not ultimate reality or relationship to ultimate reality, it's a functional relationship to reality that you can rely upon. Like it's a pragmatic argument. Like it's not a religious argument. Like it is, because there's two things, right? Like all these people are like, what is reality? Like no. How are you in right relationship to reality? That is the question. Like you need to be in right relationship, right? And in order to be in right relationship, you need to answer different questions, right? Like now we're talking about grip, right? Like we're talking about points of connection, right? Like the fingertips. And then we're talking about something that holds these points in a relationship to each other. And then you need to apply pressure, right? Like you need to, and then that allows you to manipulate the world, and it allows you to bring things towards you to intake, right? To integrate, or it allows you to express yourself. And that's the means by which you need to start thinking, right? Like that drags you out of the materialist frame. Like this is what the phenomenologists are trying to do, or whatever. But yeah, like when you're at the bottom of the well and you're looking up, you can't trust anything, right? and it's like, well, I'm gonna build something, right? Like I'm gonna build my house in heaven, and I don't know what heaven looks like, right? Like I don't know if I'm allowed on the land. I don't know the building materials. I don't know the means by which to get there, and I don't have the blueprint of the house. But I'm gonna have to do that, right? And like what is the means by which I can get myself to start participating in that project, right? Like that's how you should start thinking, like when you're talking to these people, right? Like there's this immense distance that they have from actually manifesting these things, these and that is a resistance that needs to be overcome, right? Like and part of it isn't going to be overcome at once, right? Like so it's part of it is a journey, but also part of it is conviction, right? It's like, okay, like I recognize that I'm a being, right, that is subject to certain things, right, necessarily, and I need to have a right relationship to that which I'm subjected to, right? And when you're in that, if you accept that, that requires a whole bunch of things of you. And then you're going to have to make a bunch of changes in order to be that person.
Yeah, I think the building metaphor is right, because it's not a one step fits all. It's not there's this, the Christian tradition as this, the repentance idea is you turn around and you just one turn, and I think that's not gonna work that's not gonna be a tool to evangelize to the winning crisis people, because it's not just one turn, it's a slow build, it's layers, like you said. The psychological tool that Peterson offered, that's one step. Okay, maybe I can try this step out. If okay, how's this? Is stable enough? Okay, all right, maybe, and then you can build more on that. And I think that's good. But speaking of participation, I've got to go. I've got a prayer partner that I need to go pray with. But if you guys are still on after I'm done, I'll jump on again. This is really good conversation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Teo. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's really great to have a conversation partner that actually is bringing the conversation in a constructive direction, because it yeah that's one of the other things that I'm concerned about, is like, how do we find the relevant things, right? Like we were talking about people going in different directions, right? Like obviously people need to go in a direction, right? Like I can have some judgment on the direction, whether it's selfish or selfless, right? Like that is one thing that I can say about it. But people are going to have to do what they need to do. But then how do we participate in relevant things, right? Like how do we have a shared understanding of what we need to build, and how we need to build it? And I want to have that conversation. Like that is the conversation that needs to be had. And I think framing it as well, there's a vessel that's gonna need to manifest the good, and you can build whatever you want, but you're gonna need to fit what you build to the vessel, else you're gonna have disaster. And so therefore, like there's only a limited things that you can systematize. Like IMARC came upon this idea of having a container, right? So that's a set of constraints, or set of commitments that you put on yourself as an individual, but also as a group, so that you can have a shared reality, or at least a shared part of reality, so that you can work towards the same aim. And when we have discussions, and I think this discussion was actually manifesting that, right? And you can see that it has the right spirit. Like you want to have that shared aim, right? And like if you're being confused and you're having questions, like you can have questions that are skeptical and disruptive of the aim, or there are questions that can lead the discussion into a more clear expression of what needs to be expressed, right? Because like often we can't see the things that are not connecting to people. Like there's a way in which the things that we're arguing for are not landing with people, but you can't know the ways in which people don't understand what you say without people asking questions. So that is my request for people putting questions in the chat. Want to take it away, Mark?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I'm getting kind of tired. So I don't know if we're going to be here with Teo, but I did want to drop a couple things. One of them was something we talked about before, which is this idea of one of the problems with the objective worldview is that things are objects, and an object is a one-way relationship, right? And you're not an object, and I'm not an object, and there are not objects, right? Everything is subject to our interaction with it, and we are subject to it, right? In other words, there's a reciprocal cooperative processing between you and the things that you perceive, whether that's other people, things inside your head, right? Or the transcendentals, right? Or if it's dead matter, right? So this idea of subjectivity going both ways. You're a subject of something, and you subject that thing to your existence and your perception, right? I think that's an important sort of concept. And then I do want to sort of reinforce what you've been saying. Yeah, our fundamental frustration is people don't want to do the hard work of participating in a way that will build some of these skills for people that do not have them. I understand that maybe the people in a crisis of faith have them, but I'm less concerned about those people because at least they can go back to their church eventually. I'm way more concerned about people who can't go back to church because they were never there. That's a bigger problem in some fundamental sense. And I think building the skills and the set of tools in the middle will help both groups tremendously. But if all you want to do is start more, revivals or more evangelization or more whatever, I can't help with that because I don't know anything about it. And B, I don't think it's going to help the group I think is most in need, right? And in the most dire need at the same time. The people further down the well are the important ones to fix.
And right, like we're looking at society collapsing in certain profound ways, and getting a couple people on dry land isn't going to fix society. And if you want to take responsibility as a Christian, like maybe you should also extend your concern outside of the flock and engage with the people who need it most. Like in the Netherlands, there's a bunch of African priests. This is in the Catholic Church, by the way, that don't have any command of the Dutch language because so they're speaking to old people, a dying population, and they're speaking in English, and they don't have good means to connect to new people, right? But there has been a movement from the Catholic Church to Africa in the early 1900s, and recently they've been coming back here because we lack people to be priests. Like we don't have we don't have a living tradition anymore in this country. Like it's just literally dead, and you can just gather the grains of sand on your hill all you want. Like that's not gonna do the thing that needs to happen. So like I'm just gonna tell you, like there's a bigger problem, and you're reciprocally narrowed on the thing that seems important because lost sheep are really sad, but there's wild sheep.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, and I also want to point out, look, in order to gather around something, you need not just a flag, but also a leader. And this idea of leadership and the way we create containers and communities in particular, I know it's a sore spot for everybody, but everyone's stuck in this postmodern ridiculousness where they think the postmoderns had a critique. They did not. That's technically incorrect. They had an observation. It wasn't a critique. It was obvious. It was observable. And they were wrong about that being the cause. The problem of, we'll say, materialism in the early 1900s, right, to the mid 1900s and beyond, is roughly speaking the flattening of the world and the reduction of the world down to utilitarianism, right? Because in a utilitarian world, certain scientific things make total sense, but they don't make sense in an ethical world, right? But an ethical world is not a flat world. Ethics is hard. It complexifies everything. Actually, everything gets more complex when you add ethics, right? Should I cross Ebola and anthrax? That is not a scientific question, right? And if it's only a scientific question, the answer is yes, because science. But it's not a scientific question. And so ethics complicates that. And that sucks. Like, who wants to live in a more complicated world? But we do. And it's important that we do, because otherwise the world reciprocally narrows on this flat world, right? And basically becomes hell. And if we're not paying attention to the fact that we need, as individuals in the world or persons in the world, to lead people, right, to the flag and then carry the flag and lead them further, then no one's going to do that work. And if no one does that work, the best case scenario is more chaos for everyone indefinitely. And the worst case scenario is somebody with bad intent will pick up that flag and people will rally around them. Now, that has happened before, right? I wonder where and when. This is the postmodern observation. It's not a critique, okay? The problem is they knew full well what they were doing. Without ethics, there's no way to tell when the person who picks up the flag, when the leader is bad. There's no way to tell. Ethics is the thing that allows you to discern goodness, truth, and beauty. That's what it is. Maybe it's not all it is, but that's what it is. And if you do not have that, you are in trouble. All the people who do not have that are in trouble. The people that have none of discernment for the people that have discernment for none of those things are in the most trouble. That would be my argument. The hardcore materialists, the hardcore utilitarianists, because they go hand in hand, right? You're not going to be one without being the other. Those are the people that we need to fix immediately, or start to fix immediately. And the way to do that is not to pretend that we live in a non-hierarchical world, or that we don't need to lead people to goodness, truth, and beauty, because we need to lead them there. And you can always whine about the guru problem. I get it. I understand that problem. But also, it is an unavoidable problem. It is a perennial problem. We need leaders. The number of people that can lead is very, very limited. You can't just teach anybody to be a leader or train them to be a leader or educate them to be a leader. Some people will never, ever be able to lead. Most people will never, ever be able to lead anything at all, ever. Sorry, just mathematically, that's the way it pans out with the Pareto distribution, right? So what that means is that we need to live with the fact that we're going to have lots of imperfect leaders, but we need to encourage people to lead and not discourage leadership from good people. Because what we've been doing is discouraging leadership from good people in many ways. Some of it is by punishing leadership for leadership's sake, even though there might be bad elements in leadership. And some of it is by just saying leaders are bad because charisma. You need charisma to be a really good leader. It's unavoidable. I'm sorry that that's dangerous, but lots of things are dangerous and necessary. And we're not appreciating that. We're not doing the discernment on that side. And that's, leadership is a thing. And it's important that you take responsibility for it, and full responsibility. And there's lots of aspects to leadership. And I'll get a video out on that someday. Maybe not today, but I'll get a video out on that soon. We need the leadership. It's not optional. It creates perennial problems, sure. But the perennial problems are there whether you bother with it or not. And we have to take stock of that and take it really seriously, because it's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and also there's this idea, right, like which integrated in the secular and the post-modern thinking, where you can get to the good by pruning the bad, right? Like if we just take the state and we just keep removing the flaws, then we're going to get a good state. That is just not how the world works. Like we can't remove the bad. We need to move towards the good, right? And if you privilege the removal of the bad over the moving towards the good, you're never going to manifest anything good in the world, right? Like you're going to frustrate the manifestation of the good because your objections, right? Like the reason why I'm grateful for this conversation is because the spirit was good, it was generative, right? Like all the participation was pointing towards the manifestation of what needed to be manifested. And every time that you look away, like I was talking about all of these lights, right? Like, so you can draw your own attention away, but you can also draw the attention of other people away, right? And sometimes it's good to draw someone's attention away, right? Like when they're going towards the wall, like maybe you want to steer them into a different direction so that they can manifest something that doesn't make them collide. But if you're steering people's attention away when they're trying to manifest the good instead of steering them up, right? Like maybe you're like a little bit off, just like look a little bit to the left, then you're bringing in frustration, right? Like and people seem to think, which is really strange, right? So there's this tolerance aspect, but then there's also this idea that this frustration, like, ooh, if I just, like what Peterson was saying was I agree with it, but the way that he was saying I don't agree with. It's like, well, like, are you agreeing with what he's doing or are you not? Right? Because if you're agreeing, you should just shut up. And you should just let him do it, right? And like we're flawed creatures, we're going to be imperfect in our expression of anything, right? But there's two attitudes that you can take, right? You can take the attitude of lifting up what is good, right? Which is effectively saying being is good, or you can drag down the part of being that you don't like. And the dragging down of the being that you don't like is never going to make the thing that needs to be made. Like, it's not going to bring on the kingdom of God for all the Christians. So, like, please take this stuff to heart, because I'm getting annoyed by it.
You don't want to annoy Manuel, because an unhappy Manuel is an unhappy world. Believe me, he's a force in the world. Yeah. On that note, I'm exhausted, Manuel, but I'm super hopeful. I really appreciate Teo jumping into the Discord with us and having a talk, and then that leading to this stream. And I appreciate our first conversation, because it's the first time I heard that somebody definitely, absolutely understood exactly what I was talking about, was seeing exactly what I was seeing, that I've been trying to get everybody else to take more seriously. So yeah, on that note, I'm exhausted but excited. Close us out, Manuel.
Yeah, well, I saw some comments about my fiery spirit, so let's hope that is gonna lead somewhere sometime. But no, I think there was a bunch of good things that came out of this, a bunch of new framings, new insights, and I hope that people had a fruitful relationship to this conversation, and that many things may come of this. And thank you for watching, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Make sure Paul Vanderklay watches this, and we'll see you soon on the next big live stream.
See ya.